Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Tonight, I invite you to journey across time and distance into a vast and wintry landscape shaped by revolution, ideology, and the relentless force of history. A land of towering ambition and quiet despair, of banners waving above granite plazas, of whispered truths behind closed apartment doors. This is the story of the Soviet Union, from its earliest rumblings beneath the cold marble halls of Imperial Russia to the fiery speeches of revolutionaries in exile, from the thunder of tanks across Red Square to the quiet lowering of the red flag for the final time in December 1991. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you right now? Are you already curled beneath your blanket, or just beginning to slow down from a long day? Feel free to leave a comment. It's always a joy to see how many people are joining this story from every corner of the earth. Now, make yourself as comfortable as you can. Put your phone on Do Not Disturb. Let the background sounds fade. Adjust your pillow, settle into stillness, and allow your breath to become soft and steady. There is nothing you need to do. No need to focus or follow along too closely. The story will carry you, gently, steadily, like a train moving through the snowy night, each word a rhythm on the tracks. Outside your window, picture a cold dawn rising over St. Petersburg, snow falling in a quiet forest outside a village in Siberia, a lonely radio crackling in a Khrushchevka apartment block. Tonight, you'll hear of emperors and exiles, workers and wars, idealists and despots, and the millions of ordinary people whose lives were caught in the currents of a century like no other. Let the story unfold around you. Let your thoughts drift like falling snow. Let yourself rest. And now, we begin the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. The seeds of revolution. Imperial Russia before the fall. To understand the Soviet Union, we must begin with what came before, with the empire that once ruled over 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, a realm of shimmering palaces and snowbound villages, of czars crowned in gold, and peasants scraping through winter with frozen fingers and empty bellies. This was Imperial Russia, vast, beautiful, brutal, a land of contrasts, where glittering balls were held beneath chandeliers in St. Petersburg, while hundreds of miles away, serfs lived in huts made of mud and straw. It was a place suspended in time, where the medieval and the modern existed side by side, locked in tension. By the dawn of the 20th century, Russia was still ruled by an absolute monarch, Tsar Nicholas II, a man born into power but never quite made for it. He was soft-spoken, deeply religious, and staunchly committed to the idea that he had been divinely appointed to rule. His belief in autocracy was unshakable, and yet he was ruling a country that was already beginning to splinter beneath the weight of change. The roots of revolution ran deep. For centuries, Russian society had been rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood the Tsar and the aristocracy, a narrow band of nobles who owned vast estates, controlled the government, and lived lives of unimaginable luxury. Below them, the vast majority of the population toiled in poverty. Most were peasants, many of whom had only recently been freed from serfdom in 1861. Even after emancipation, their lives remained harsh, bound by debts, land shortages, and the unyielding cycles of rural life. In the cities, a new working class was emerging. Factories had begun to spring up in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other industrial centers. With them came a wave of urban laborers, men, women, and even children, drawn in from the countryside by the promise of wages, however meager. They worked long hours under grueling conditions, in soot-filled air and deafening noise, often sleeping in overcrowded dormitories or crude barracks. There were no unions, no protections, and no voice for the workers. Discontent simmered. Education, meanwhile, was limited. Literacy rates were low, especially outside urban areas. Schools existed, but they were often run by the Orthodox Church and offered little in the way of critical thought. Still, new ideas had begun to filter in, whispered in cafes, shared in samizdat pamphlets passed hand to hand, discussed in hushed voices beneath flickering oil lamps. Ideas of liberty, of equality, of revolution. The Russian Empire was a patchwork of peoples and languages. Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Uzbeks, Tatars, Poles, Finns. And many of these minority groups longed for autonomy, or at least recognition. The empire held them tight, often with military force, and any expression of nationalism was swiftly suppressed. The Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, kept watch. Arrests were common. Exiles to Siberia were frequent. Fear became part of everyday life for those who questioned the order of things. But repression, while effective in the short term, often breeds resistance. The more the Tsar tried to clamp down on dissent, the more determined the opposition became. Among the growing chorus of voices calling for change, one name stood out: Karl Marx. Though a German philosopher who had died decades earlier, his writings on class struggle, capitalism, and the eventual rise of the proletariat struck a chord with many Russian intellectuals and activists. They saw in Marxism a roadmap, a guide to dismantling the old order and building something entirely new. By the 1890s, underground Marxist circles were forming throughout Russia. Students, writers, and factory workers gathered to study Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, envisioning a future where the workers would no longer bow to the whims of czars and factory owners. But revolution was not just an intellectual dream. It was being driven by hard realities. Famines in the 1890s devastated the countryside, killing hundreds of thousands and fueling anger at the government's poor response. Strikes began to break out in major cities. The police cracked down, but the strikes kept coming. Small protests gave way to mass movements. In 1905, something snapped. On a frigid January day, thousands of peaceful demonstrators marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carrying petitions for better wages, more rights, and an end to repression. They were unarmed, many carrying religious icons and portraits of the Tsar himself. They believed the Tsar would listen. They believed he was a benevolent father figure who simply hadn't heard their cries. They were wrong. Troops opened fire. The massacre that followed would be remembered as Bloody Sunday. Over 200 people were killed, with hundreds more injured. The myth of the Tsar as protector was shattered in an instant. Strikes exploded across the empire. Sailors mutinied. Peasants rioted. The 1905 revolution, though ultimately unsuccessful in overthrowing the regime, had planted irreversible seeds. Nicholas II, under pressure, made limited concessions. He created the Duma, a parliamentary body meant to give the people a voice. But it was a half measure. The Tsar retained veto power, and the Duma was repeatedly dissolved whenever it became inconvenient. Disillusionment returned. In the shadows, revolutionary groups gained strength. The social revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, and the more radical Bolsheviks all fought for influence. Exiled thinkers like Vladimir Lenin wrote from abroad, sending back pamphlets, instructions, and hope. Within Russia, secret meetings were held in basements and alleyways. The Tsar's regime tightened its grip, but the cracks were now too deep to seal. Russia, too, was changing in other ways. The railroads stretched farther each year, binding the empire's vastness together. Telegraph lines sped information from one end of the continent to the other. A modern world was coming, whether the Tsar wanted it or not. But modernity brought its own challenges: inflation, rising food prices, and a growing awareness among the people of just how unequal their society was. In St. Petersburg and Moscow, newspapers carried stories of wealth and decadence. Lavish court balls, diamond-studded dresses, and imperial yachts, all while many went hungry. Even within the aristocracy, there were whispers of doubt. Some nobles questioned the Tsar's choices. his reliance on mystics like the infamous Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over the royal family would become scandalous and destabilizing. And then, in 1914, war arrived. Russia entered the First World War with patriotic fervor. But the realities of the front were grim, poorly equipped, badly led, and stretched across vast and treacherous terrain. The Russian army suffered staggering losses. Millions were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Morale plummeted. Soldiers deserted. Families starved back home as food shortages worsened and inflation soared. The Tsar made a critical error. He left the capital to take direct command of the army, leaving the government in the hands of his German-born wife, Alexandra, and Rasputin, whose growing power and erratic behavior horrified the court and the public alike. As the war dragged on, the country descended into chaos. Trains carrying food never arrived. Bread lines grew longer. Strikes paralyzed factories. The capital, renamed Petrograd, became a city of desperation. Anger swelled in the hearts of soldiers, workers, peasants, and students alike. By early 1917, revolution was no longer a matter of if, but when. But before that turning point arrived, Russia had already been set on a course it could not escape. The seeds of revolution had been planted in the soil of inequality, repression, and suffering. They had taken root in the minds of philosophers and poets, in the sweat of factory workers, and in the silent hunger of peasant children. The Tsars had ruled for over 300 years. But now, the great oak of empire was beginning to crack. The winds of history were shifting, and in the distance, change was coming, swift, unrelenting, and unstoppable. Marx, Lenin, and the birth of Bolshevism. As Imperial Russia strained under the weight of its contradictions, centuries of autocracy, economic hardship, and a rising tide of unrest, a very different revolution had already begun to take shape far beyond its borders, not with gunshots or street protests, but with the scratch of a pen. In the heart of 19th century Europe, Karl Marx was writing. Born in 1818 in Trier, in what is now Germany, Marx came of age in a continent trembling beneath the forces of industrialization. Factories were rising, cities were swelling, and the old orders, kings, clergy, landed nobility, were finding themselves challenged by a new, rapidly growing class, the bourgeoisie. Alongside them, a working class was forming, the proletariat, a group defined not by ownership, but by labor. Marx observed these seismic shifts with the precision of a scientist and the fury of a prophet. He believed that all history was shaped by the struggle between classes, the oppressor and the oppressed. In ancient times, this had been masters and slaves. Later, it became lords and serfs. In the industrial age, it was the capitalist and the worker. His most famous works, the Communist Manifesto, co-written with Friedrich Engels in 1848 and Das Kapital, laid out a theory of history as a series of inevitable upheavals. According to Marx, capitalism would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, paving the way for a stateless, classless society, a communist utopia where the means of production were shared and the exploitation of labor was abolished. To many in the 19th century, these ideas were dangerous, but to others, they were liberating. In Russia, where inequality was sharper than almost anywhere in Europe, Marx's theories took on a powerful, even spiritual dimension. They offered not just an explanation for suffering, but a pathway out of it. Among those most drawn to Marxist thought was a young man born in Simbirsk in 1870, the son of a noble family, but destined to become one of history's most consequential revolutionaries. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, but the world would come to know him as Lenin. Lenin's journey into revolutionary politics was, in many ways, a personal one. When he was just 17, his older brother, Alexander, was arrested and executed for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The event shattered the family, and marked Lenin for life. Where Alexander had been part of a more romantic, populist tradition, hoping to spark change through violence and martyrdom, Lenin would become something colder, more calculated. He did not seek symbolic acts. He wanted total revolution. By the time he reached adulthood, Lenin had immersed himself in Marxist theory. He devoured Marx's writings, translated them, debated them, and adapted them to the specific conditions of Russia. In doing so, he developed a distinct approach, one that would place him at odds with many other Marxists of the time. Lenin believed that Russia, despite being largely agrarian and lacking the industrial maturity Marx envisioned for a proletarian uprising, could skip historical stages through force of will and organization. He envisioned a vanguard party, a tightly disciplined, ideologically pure group of revolutionaries who would seize power on behalf of the working class. This elite cadre would not wait for capitalism to ripen and collapse on its own. They would accelerate history. In 1903, at a meeting of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in London, the movement split into two factions over this very question. One group, the Mensheviks, supported a broader, more democratic form of party membership. They believed in gradual reform, mass participation, and alliances with liberal movements. Lenin's faction, the Bolsheviks, took a harder line. The name meant majority, though in truth they were often in the minority. Lenin argued for centralized control, iron discipline, and a revolutionary strategy that did not rely on the unpredictable will of the masses. This divide would shape Russian politics for years to come. Forced into exile after his activities attracted the attention of the Tsarist secret police, Lenin spent much of the early 1900s in cities like Munich, Geneva, Paris, and eventually Switzerland. These years of exile were not idle. Lenin wrote endlessly: polemics, manifestos, essays, and critiques. He organized cells of Bolshevik supporters. He read foreign newspapers, monitored developments in Russia, and cultivated contacts with radicals across Europe. But more than anything, he waited. Waited for a moment when the empire he despised would finally falter. Back in Russia, Marxist ideas were spreading among factory workers, students, and intellectuals. Illegal printing presses churned out leaflets and underground newspapers. Smuggled books changed hands in alleyways. Secret reading groups studied Marx, Engels, and Lenin by candlelight. Revolutionary fervor mingled with hope and anxiety. And yet, Marxism was not the only revolutionary current running through the empire. There were also anarchists, agrarian socialists, liberal reformers, and nationalists, all envisioning different futures, often clashing as much with each other as with the state. Lenin's genius, and some would say his tragedy, was in his singular focus. While others debated and doubted, he prepared. He believed that history could be bent, but only by those with the will and the tools to do so. He saw the Tsarist regime not as invincible, but as hollow, a rotting structure waiting to be pushed. What it needed, Lenin believed, was not just criticism, but confrontation. And he was not alone. Other figures began to emerge across the revolutionary landscape. Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and writer, once aligned with the Mensheviks, but later a key Bolshevik ally. Julius Martov, the intellectual heart of the Menshevik movement. Alexandra Kollontai, a fierce advocate for workers and women's rights, who would later become the world's first female cabinet minister. Dozens of others, some fiery, some quiet, all radical in their own ways. They were exiles, prisoners, agitators. They operated in shadows, traveled under false names, and lived with the constant risk of arrest or death. But their vision burned bright. Still, Lenin remained a figure apart. In exile, he developed a reputation as unyielding, often difficult, prone to excommunicating even close allies if they deviated from the party line. To him, ideological clarity was everything. Compromise was weakness. Revolution, in his eyes, was not a matter of spontaneity or mass feeling. It was war, and war required discipline. The First World War would prove to be the final ingredient Lenin needed. As Europe descended into conflict in 1914, most socialist parties across the continent abandoned their anti-war principles and supported their national governments. Lenin was appalled. He denounced the war as an imperialist slaughter, a capitalist conflict in which workers were being sent to die for the profits of their masters. This stance isolated him further, but it also sharpened his message. While other leftists tried to reconcile patriotism with socialism, Lenin declared that the war should be transformed into a civil war. He called for soldiers to turn their guns not on foreign enemies, but on their own oppressive regimes. It was a radical position, and it resonated. As the war dragged on, Russia bled, the people suffered, and the legitimacy of the Tsarist regime disintegrated. Then, in early 1917, the unexpected happened. Revolution erupted in Petrograd. The monarchy collapsed. The Romanov dynasty, after more than 300 years, was swept away. Lenin was still in exile when news reached him, but he moved quickly. With the help of the Germans, who hoped his return would destabilize Russia further, Lenin boarded a sealed train and crossed war-torn Europe, arriving in Petrograd in April 1917. He stepped off the train and immediately made his intentions clear. The provisional government, hastily assembled after the Tsar's abdication, was not the revolution's end. It was its prelude. Lenin called for peace, land, and bread, promises aimed squarely at the war-weary, the landless, and the hungry. He denounced the provisional government as a continuation of bourgeois power. He demanded that all power be transferred to the Soviets, grassroots councils of workers and soldiers that had sprung up across the country. These ideas, laid out in his April theses, stunned even some of his fellow Bolsheviks. But the people were listening. The tide was turning. The world was about to change. And Lenin, with his years of preparation, unwavering ideology, and revolutionary discipline, was ready to seize it. 1917, the year of two revolutions. History rarely moves in straight lines. More often, it stumbles, turns back on itself, and then, suddenly, erupts. For Russia, 1917 was such a year when centuries of autocratic rule ended almost overnight, and when power passed from one hand to another in dizzying succession. A year of breadlines and barricades, soldiers and speeches, dreams and delusions. A year that would change not only Russia, but the world. And it began not with a bomb or a battle, but with bread. By the winter of 1917, Russia was collapsing under the weight of war. The First World War had dragged on for nearly 3 years. On the front lines, soldiers faced relentless misery, mud, lice, hunger, and the grim rhythm of death. Thousands were killed each day. Ammunition was scarce. Boots were shared between men. Rifles sometimes too. Command was disorganized. Morale had evaporated. Back home, the situation was no better. The cities were starving. Long queues stretched across Petrograd, once the Tsar's elegant capital, now gripped by hunger and despair. Fuel was in short supply. Transportation systems had broken down. Factories were shutting their doors. Inflation had made wages meaningless. The streets buzzed with frustration. On March 8th, 1917, February 23rd by the old Julian calendar still used in Russia, a group of women textile workers in Petrograd took to the streets to demand bread. It was International Women's Day, and what began as a modest protest grew rapidly into a mass demonstration. Thousands joined them, workers from factories, students, men returning from shifts, soldiers on leave. They marched through snow-covered boulevards shouting, "Peace, bread, down with the Tsar." Over the next few days, the protests intensified. Strikes paralyzed industry. Barricades rose. Police lost control. Soldiers were ordered to fire on the crowds, but many refused. In some regiments, the troops turned on their officers instead, shooting them and joining the demonstrators. The empire was unraveling. At first, Tsar Nicholas II, who had left the capital to command the military at the front, underestimated the scale of the unrest. He believed it to be another temporary disturbance, nothing new in Russia's turbulent urban centers. But this time, the order would not be restored. Key military units defected. Public institutions collapsed. Petrograd became ungovernable. On March 15, 1917, with no army loyal enough to save him, and with pressure mounting from all sides, Nicholas abdicated the throne. He handed power to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who refused to accept it. Just like that, the Romanov dynasty, over 300 years of imperial rule, was over. The centuries-old autocracy had ended not in blood-soaked revolution, but in a chain of telegrams, a few hurried declarations, and the reluctant surrender of a deeply isolated monarch. It was not Lenin or the Bolsheviks who had overthrown the Tsar. Not yet. The February Revolution had been spontaneous, unplanned, and broadly supported by a wide coalition of liberals, moderates, workers, and soldiers. In the Tsar's place, a provisional government was formed, made up largely of liberal and moderate politicians. It was meant to serve as a temporary authority until a democratic constituent assembly could be elected. For the first time in Russian history, the possibility of a constitutional democracy flickered into view. But from the beginning, the new government was fragile. It shared power, uneasily, with a parallel structure, the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies that had reformed in the wake of the uprising. The Soviet held no formal legal authority, but it had legitimacy in the eyes of the people and the loyalty of the armed forces. Together, the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet created a condition known as dual power, two centers of authority pulling in different directions. The Provisional Government, led by figures like Prince Georgy Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, wanted to maintain order, rebuild state institutions, and continue the war effort alongside the Allies. But this was deeply unpopular. Most Russians, especially workers, peasants, and frontline soldiers, wanted peace, land reform, and food. The Petrograd Soviet, under pressure from grassroots radicals, demanded more sweeping change, and hovering outside the centers of power, watching carefully, was a man who had waited for precisely this kind of chaos, Vladimir Lenin. In April, after years of exile, Lenin returned to Petrograd in a dramatic, orchestrated arrival. The Germans, who believed he could destabilize Russia further, allowed him safe passage by train through war-torn Europe. Stepping onto the platform at Finland Station, Lenin wasted no time. He denounced the provisional government as a bourgeois fraud. In a speech that stunned even his own Bolshevik comrades, he declared that the February Revolution was incomplete. True revolution, he insisted, had not yet begun. His April theses rejected any compromise with the existing authorities. He called for immediate withdrawal from the war, the nationalization of all land and industry, and the transfer of all power to the Soviets. To many, this seemed absurd. The provisional government was popular. Lenin's Bolsheviks were still a minority among revolutionaries. But Russia was changing rapidly. The longer the war dragged on, the more unstable the situation became. Throughout the spring and summer, discontent grew. Peasants began seizing land on their own. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers. In the factories, strikes became more aggressive. The provisional government tried to maintain control, but its position grew weaker by the day. In July, frustrated by the pace of change, thousands of workers and soldiers took to the streets in what became known as the July Days, a premature uprising, largely leaderless and disorganized. The Bolsheviks were blamed. Lenin went into hiding. Several Bolsheviks were arrested. For a moment, it seemed the movement had been broken, but it had only just begun. In August, a new threat emerged, not from the left, but from the right. General Lava Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, attempted to march on Petrograd in what many feared was a coup to restore military dictatorship. The provisional government, panicked, turned to the very Bolsheviks it had just vilified and asked for help defending the city. The Bolsheviks agreed and were suddenly handed weapons, released from prison, and allowed to organize freely. When Kornilov's coup collapsed, the Bolsheviks emerged stronger than ever. Their credibility soared. In the eyes of many, they were the only force capable of defending the revolution. By September, the Bolsheviks had majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Lenin, still in hiding in Finland, began planning for a second revolution. He believed the time was ripe. The provisional government was paralyzed. Popular support for the Bolsheviks was rising. The war was still ongoing. Hunger still gnawed at the cities. Land reform had stalled. Faith in democracy was fading. But not all Bolsheviks agreed. Some urged patience. Some feared civil war. Lenin was adamant. Revolution, he said, was not something to wait for. It was something to make. On the night of October 25th, 1917, November 7th in the Gregorian calendar, Bolshevik-led forces, including the Red Guards, began their move. They seized bridges, telegraph offices, and train stations in Petrograd. The Winter Palace, where the provisional government was holed up, was surrounded. Unlike the romantic images painted later, the actual storming of the palace was slow, cautious, and strangely quiet. There was little resistance. The few loyalist troops were outnumbered or unwilling to fight. Inside, government officials were arrested one by one. By morning, the Bolsheviks controlled the capital. The October Revolution had succeeded. Within hours, Lenin appeared before the Congress of Soviets and announced that the provisional government had been overthrown. A new government, the Council of People's Commissars, would be formed, led by the Bolsheviks. Power, Lenin declared, now belonged to the Soviets. To the world, it seemed a sudden shift. But to those who had lived through 1917, it was the inevitable culmination of months of turmoil. Two revolutions had occurred in a single year. The first, in February, sweeping away monarchy and birthing a fragile democracy. The second, in October, replacing that fledgling democracy with revolutionary socialism. And still, the story was only beginning. The Bolsheviks had taken power, but they had not yet secured it. Across Russia, forces were already gathering. Loyalists, liberals, Mensheviks, monarchists, foreign powers, and nationalist groups. The nation was fracturing. The old order was gone, but the new one had not yet solidified. The stage was set for a bitter, brutal civil war. But for now, the Bolsheviks stood victorious. Russia had been reborn into uncertainty, into upheaval, into a future no one could fully predict. Civil War and the Red Terror. By the end of 1917, Russia had changed beyond recognition. The Romanovs were gone, the provisional government dismantled, and power now rested in the hands of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. But victory in Petrograd was not victory across the empire. The October Revolution had not brought peace. It had brought a question. Who would rule Russia now? The answer would be written not in ballots or manifestos, but in blood. The Russian Civil War, which erupted in 1918, was not a single conflict between two clearly defined sides. It was a fractured, chaotic struggle involving dozens of factions, ideologies, armies, and causes. It stretched across every corner of Russia, from the icy tundras of the north to the dusty steppe of Central Asia. It would last over 4 years and claim millions of lives, not just on the battlefield, but in villages, towns, and cities where famine, disease, and terror reigned. At the heart of one side stood the Bolsheviks, also known as the Reds. They controlled the central cities, Petrograd and Moscow, and the industrial heart of the country. Their promise was revolutionary, a new world without private property, without nobility, without exploitation. Lenin and his closest allies believed they were shaping the future not just of Russia but of humanity. Opposing them was a broad coalition of forces known collectively as the Whites. But the White Army was not a unified movement. It was a fractured alliance of monarchists, liberals, conservatives, nationalists, and moderate socialists. Some wanted to restore the Tsar. Others dreamed of a constitutional republic. Many simply opposed Bolshevik rule. Among their leaders were former imperial generals like Anton Denikin, Alexander Kolchak, and Nikolai Yudenich, each commanding separate fronts, each with their own ambitions and little coordination between them. Caught in the middle of it all were the people. Farmers, villagers, factory workers, students, and soldiers. Many had no clear loyalty, no ideological alignment. They were simply trying to survive in a world unraveling around them. The war began in earnest in early 1918. It spread rapidly. In the south, Cossack forces rose against the Bolsheviks. In the east, Kolchak established a military dictatorship in Siberia. In the northwest, Yudenich prepared for a push toward Petrograd. The Allies, Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, intervened as well, hoping to keep Russia in the war against Germany, and later to suppress Bolshevism altogether. Foreign troops landed in Arkhangelsk, Vladivostok, and Murmansk. The Red Army, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, responded with ruthless efficiency. Trotsky, once a Menshevik rival of Lenin, had joined the Bolsheviks before the October Revolution and quickly became one of their most capable commanders. Charismatic, strategic, and uncompromising, he transformed a ragged group of volunteers into a disciplined military machine. Trotsky traveled by armored train, moving from front to front, rallying troops, delivering fiery speeches, and enforcing strict discipline. Desertion was punished by execution. Cowardice was met with summary justice. Loyalty was demanded, not requested. The Bolsheviks understood that they were fighting not just a war for territory, but a war for survival. Every enemy, real or perceived, was treated as a threat to the revolution itself. And so began one of the darkest chapters in the history of the new Soviet state, the Red Terror. It began in the summer of 1918, after an attempted assassination of Lenin by a socialist revolutionary named Fanny Kaplan. Though Lenin survived, the Bolsheviks responded with sweeping brutality. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, precursor to the KGB, was unleashed. Under the leadership of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka operated with near-total impunity. They raided homes, arrested enemies of the people, and carried out executions without trial. Anyone suspected of opposing the regime, former nobles, priests, officers, intellectuals, or even other socialists, could be labeled a counter-revolutionary and shot. Entire families were sometimes targeted. The goal was not just to eliminate opposition, but to instill fear. In cellars, prisons, and forests, the killings were carried out quietly, methodically. Victims were told they were being transferred or released, then taken to a wall or ditch. A pistol to the back of the head. One shot, then the next. In towns seized by the Red Army, the Cheka followed behind, rooting out dissent. In some cases, they executed hostages, ordinary citizens, if resistance was suspected nearby. In others, they posted lists of names marked for death as a warning to the rest. The terror was not limited to the Reds. White forces carried out their own brutal reprisals. In areas under their control, Bolshevik sympathizers, Jewish communities, and suspected revolutionaries were often massacred. Pogroms erupted, prisons filled, executions were common. The Civil War became not just a military struggle, but a spiral of vengeance and survival. Whole villages were burned. Railways were sabotaged. Cities changed hands multiple times. In Ukraine, anarchist forces led by Nestor Makhno created their own autonomous zones, fighting both Reds and Whites. In Central Asia, anti-Bolshevik resistance movements flared. In Siberia, chaos reigned. The Bolsheviks, however, held key advantages. They controlled the industrial heartland, giving them better access to supplies and factories. They held the major railways, allowing troops and resources to be moved quickly. And most importantly, they had a unified command and a clear, uncompromising ideology. The Whites, by contrast, were divided. Their leaders distrusted one another. They failed to offer a compelling alternative to Bolshevik rule. Many were tainted by their association with the old regime. Their inability, or unwillingness, to promise land reform alienated peasants. Where the Bolsheviks promised to redistribute land, the Whites often sought to return it to former landlords. Peasants, reluctant to side with either faction, sometimes supported the Reds simply to avoid a return to the past. Meanwhile, life for ordinary Russians became unbearable. The countryside was ravaged by requisitions and raids. The cities starved. Inflation rendered money useless. The Bolsheviks introduced a policy known as war communism, an attempt to centrally control the economy, requisition grain from the peasants, and direct all resources toward the war effort. The result was devastating. Peasants, with little incentive to grow food they could not keep, reduced production. Grain hoarding became common. Famine spread. Entire families fled the cities in search of food. Millions died, not from bullets, but from hunger and disease. Still, the Bolsheviks pressed on. By 1920, they had defeated most of the White forces. The southern front collapsed. Siberia was retaken. Foreign troops, demoralized and disillusioned, withdrew. One by one, the counter-revolutionary movements were crushed. Yet even as victory loomed, unrest remained. In 1921, a major rebellion broke out at the Kronstadt naval base, once a bastion of Bolshevik support. Sailors, disillusioned by repression and hunger, demanded free elections, freedom of speech, and an end to grain seizures. Lenin called the uprising a betrayal. Trotsky led the assault. The rebellion was crushed with heavy casualties. By the end of 1921, the civil war was effectively over. The Bolsheviks stood triumphant, but at an enormous cost. Russia lay in ruins. Its economy was shattered, its population traumatized. Entire generations had been lost to war, hunger, and repression. The revolution had begun with hope, but it had hardened into something else. Something sharper, colder, more unforgiving. Yet out of this chaos, the foundations of a new state were laid. The Soviet Union had not yet been formally declared, but its architecture, political, ideological, and psychological, was already in place. The Cheka remained, now embedded in the fabric of the state. The Red Army, forged in fire, had become a symbol of unity and discipline. The Communist Party, once a revolutionary movement, was now the unquestioned authority. Lenin, though physically weakened by illness and injury, remained the central figure. Around him, new power brokers began to emerge. Men like Joseph Stalin, who would soon begin his slow, relentless rise. The dream of global revolution, so often spoken of in earlier years, had faded. The Bolsheviks now focused inward, on rebuilding, on consolidating power, on remaking society from the ground up. The revolution had won, but the revolution had also devoured many of its own. What remained was no longer a movement of idealists and dreamers. It was a government of survivors. And in the shadows, the long night of the Soviet century was just beginning. The rise of the Soviet Union. When the last gunshots of the Russian Civil War fell silent and the battle-scarred fields gave way to a weary and devastated land, something new began to emerge from the ruins. What had once been the Russian Empire, a vast and aging monarchy stitched together with old loyalties and imperial ambition, was gone. In its place stood an uncertain, unfinished experiment. Not merely a government, but an idea. An idea called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The war had been won by the Bolsheviks, but victory was not the same as stability. Russia was in pieces, cities were hollowed out, railways were broken. Entire regions had operated under different governments for years. Monarchists, foreign occupiers, anarchist councils. The land was scattered like shattered glass, and it would take years to reassemble. But reassemble it they did. In December 1922, after months of negotiations, restructurings, and ideological deliberation, 4 republics, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, FSR, the Transcaucasian SFSR, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Belarusian SSR, joined together to form a single federal state, the USSR. It was announced with little ceremony, but great ideological importance. The name alone was revolutionary. Not a kingdom, not an empire, not a republic in the Western sense, but a union of socialist republics, where power, at least in theory, belonged to the working class. It was, at its heart, a statement of intent, a rejection of the old world, a promise, or a warning, of something new. The formation of the Soviet Union wasn't just political, it was deeply symbolic. The Tsar's double-headed eagle had been torn down. In its place, the hammer and sickle, a new emblem to represent workers and peasants. Labor and land joined in unity. Red banners flew where royal crests once hung. Old calendars were replaced, church bells went silent, and portraits of Lenin appeared on factory walls and schoolroom blackboards. The new Soviet state was built not only on territory, but on ideology. Lenin and the Bolsheviks saw themselves not merely as leaders of a country, but as midwives of a global revolution. The USSR was to be a model, a launching pad, a living embodiment of Marxist principles reshaped for Russian soil. But theory and reality were rarely aligned. In the years immediately following the war, Lenin faced a desperate country. Famine stalked the countryside. Over 5 million people died in the 1921 to 1922 famine alone, made worse by grain requisitioning and drought. Factories lay idle, inflation soared, civil unrest continued to simmer, especially in rural areas where peasants were angry at Bolshevik policies that had stripped them of crops and livestock during the war years. To prevent total collapse, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921, a temporary retreat from pure communism. It allowed for limited private trade, small-scale private farming, and a more market-based approach in certain sectors. The goal was pragmatic, to revive the economy and prevent further rebellion. Under NEP, village markets reopened. Peasants could sell surplus grain. Small businesses returned. It was controversial among die-hard Marxists, but it stabilized the country. The NEP years were, in many ways, a strange time, a liminal moment in Soviet history. It was a period where radical ideology coexisted with entrepreneurial activity, where peasant markets bustled again beneath portraits of Lenin, where jazz music played in smoky cafes in Moscow, while commissars debated dialectical materialism in the next room. It was not yet the totalitarian USSR of later years, but it was also not free. The Communist Party, now renamed from the original Bolshevik Party, was the sole political power in the state. All opposition parties had been banned. Elections were held, but only with approved candidates. The Cheka, renamed the GPU, continued to monitor the population, suppress dissent, and conduct surveillance. The press was strictly controlled. Religion was discouraged. Churches were repurposed, priests arrested, and religious instruction removed from schools. The state was to be secular, scientific, and socialist. Education became one of the primary tools for shaping the new citizen. Literacy campaigns swept across the country. Propaganda, wrapped in the language of enlightenment, was everywhere. Posters urged workers to read, to study Lenin, to obey the party. Children were taught that history had begun anew in 1917, and that they were pioneers of a new age. And at the center of this new mythology stood Lenin. Though he had spent most of his life in exile or underground, by the early 1920s, Lenin was now the undisputed leader of a vast, reimagined nation. But his health was failing. In 1922, he suffered a series of strokes that left him partially paralyzed. By 1923, he could no longer speak or write with clarity. He watched, powerless, as others maneuvered for influence behind the scenes. In one of his final acts, Lenin dictated a document known as the Testament. In it, he expressed grave concerns about one man in particular, Joseph Stalin. Stalin, who had risen quietly through the ranks, had become General Secretary of the Communist Party. At first glance, it was a bureaucratic position, administrative, logistical. But Stalin used it shrewdly, placing loyalists in key positions, controlling access to files, and consolidating power behind the scenes. Lenin, increasingly alarmed by Stalin's ruthlessness and ambition, warned the party to remove him. But Lenin died in January 1924, before his warning could be acted upon. His death marked the end of an era. The man who had sparked revolution, led the Bolsheviks through war, and shaped the early Soviet Union, was gone. His funeral was a massive state affair. Millions mourned, though many had never seen him in person. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, a secular saint preserved for eternity. Across the country, statues of Lenin multiplied. His image became sacred. His words were quoted endlessly, even selectively. Leninism became more than a political doctrine. It became orthodoxy. Yet behind the rituals of mourning, a quiet battle for succession was unfolding. Several men now stood at the forefront of the party. Leon Trotsky, the fiery revolutionary and architect of the Red Army. Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, longtime Bolsheviks with deep party roots. Nikolai Bukharin, an influential theorist and editor. And Stalin, patient, reserved, and calculating. Trotsky was the most famous, both inside and outside Russia. His speeches had inspired armies. His intellect was razor-sharp, but he lacked allies. He was seen as arrogant, too independent, too critical of the growing bureaucracy. Stalin, by contrast, made few public waves, but built quiet loyalty. He worked the apparatus. He played the long game. In the years following Lenin's death, Stalin began to sideline his rivals, outmaneuvering them through party congresses, alliances, and strategic purges. The centralization of power was beginning, not just administratively, but psychologically. Authority no longer came from collective leadership. It came from the top, the leader. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to expand its internal infrastructure. New republics were added. In 1924, the USSR adopted its first constitution, formalizing its structure as a union of multiple Soviet socialist republics. It described a federal state built on equality and mutual cooperation, though in practice, power flowed almost entirely from Moscow. The economy slowly recovered under the NEP, but tensions remained. Many in the party feared that capitalism was returning through the back door. Others argued that the NEP had outlived its usefulness. Beneath the surface, a fundamental question simmered. How communist should the Soviet Union really be? For now, that question remained unresolved. On the international stage, the young Soviet Union was viewed with suspicion, hostility, and sometimes awe. Western powers had never recognized the legitimacy of the Bolshevik government during the Civil War. Some had even tried to overthrow it. Now, diplomats tread carefully. Germany was the first major country to open diplomatic relations. Others followed cautiously. The Communist International, or Comintern, was established to promote revolution abroad. Bolsheviks still dreamed of world revolution, but realpolitik increasingly took precedence. The Soviet Union was isolated, vulnerable, and in need of time. Time to heal, time to rebuild, time to prepare. And so, in the quiet years between wars, the Soviet Union began to take shape, not as an idea, but as a state. It had survived famine, civil war, and isolation. It had defeated czars and generals, foreign armies, and internal rebels. It had forged, from chaos, something durable, not democratic, not free, but enduring. It would not remain quiet for long. The 5-year plans and forced collectivization. By the late 1920s, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The revolution had survived. The civil war had been won. The economy, though fragile, had stabilized under the new economic policy. Lenin was gone, and the struggle for leadership had quietly, methodically come to an end. Joseph Stalin, once a quiet bureaucrat in the shadows, now held firm control over the levers of power. But for Stalin, survival was not enough. He did not want the Soviet Union to merely exist. He wanted it to transform, to leap forward, to defy history, to catch and surpass the great capitalist powers of the West. He envisioned a modern, industrialized Soviet empire that would never again be vulnerable to foreign invasion, economic backwardness, or internal rebellion. And to do that, he would need to reshape the country from the ground up. The cornerstone of that transformation would be a series of centralized economic blueprints known as the 5-year plans. Bold, sweeping programs that aimed to convert the Soviet Union from a predominantly rural, agrarian society into a formidable industrial superpower. The first plan was launched in 1928. Its goals were astonishing in their ambition. Double industrial output, triple coal production, massively expand iron and steel capacity, electrify the countryside, and build new cities from scratch in Siberia and beyond. Factories were to rise where there had only been forests. Railways were to snake across desolate tundra. Entire industries were to be created in places where even roads had never reached. Giant hydroelectric dams, steel plants, and tractor factories became symbols of progress, monuments to human will, state planning, and collective labor. To the world, it looked like a miracle in motion. Posters showed proud workers hammering steel and smiling farmers in red scarves. Songs and poems celebrated the heroic builders of socialism. The Soviet press reported milestone after milestone, announcing record-breaking output in coal, oil, and machinery. But behind the scenes, the reality was far more complex and far more brutal. The 5-year plans were not mere suggestions or targets. They were demands, inflexible, absolute, and enforced by fear. Regional officials who failed to meet quotas could be removed, imprisoned, or worse. Factory managers falsified numbers to avoid punishment. Workers were pushed to exhaustion, often under unsafe and inhumane conditions. Safety standards were non-existent. Machinery was primitive. Accidents were frequent. Housing for workers was often temporary, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Still, construction moved forward at a staggering pace. Whole cities were built almost overnight. Magnitogorsk in the Urals rose from nothing to become one of the largest steel-producing centers in the world. Dneprstroy, a massive hydroelectric dam on the Dnieper River, became a symbol of Soviet ambition. A river literally reshaped by human hands. But industrialization could not succeed without a steady supply of food, and that meant transforming the countryside as well. In the eyes of Stalin and the party leadership, agriculture was inefficient, disorganized, and dangerously independent. Millions of peasants owned or worked small plots of land, growing crops for their own use or for sale in local markets. This system had persisted for centuries, but in the Soviet worldview, it was an obstacle, a relic of the old order. So began the second prong of Stalin's transformation, forced collectivization. The idea was simple in theory. Instead of millions of scattered farms, the land would be consolidated into large, state-controlled collective farms, or kolkhozes. Equipment would be shared, quotas would be imposed, surplus grain would be collected by the state and redistributed as needed, especially to the rapidly growing urban workforce. In reality, collectivization was chaos. Launched in earnest in 1929, the policy was met with fierce resistance. Many peasants refused to give up their land, their livestock, or their autonomy. To the state, this was not seen as a negotiation. It was a battle of class enemies. Those who resisted were labeled kulaks, a deliberately vague term that originally referred to wealthier peasants, but soon came to mean anyone who opposed collectivization, or simply owned more than a few cows or a slightly larger house. The campaign against the kulaks was brutal. Thousands were arrested. Others were shot. Entire families were deported to remote labor camps in Siberia or Central Asia. Some villages were emptied entirely. In many regions, peasants responded by slaughtering their own animals rather than hand them over. Cattle, pigs, and horses were killed en masse. This act of defiance only deepened the crisis and the state's resolve. Grain quotas were imposed, with little regard for reality. When targets weren't met, authorities simply took more, often leaving nothing behind. This led to one of the most devastating man-made disasters of the 20th century: famine. Nowhere was the suffering more acute than in Ukraine, a region known for its fertile black soil, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. In 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians died in a famine now widely known as the Holodomor, meaning death by hunger. Entire villages starved. People ate grass, bark, and rodents. In the most desperate cases, cannibalism was reported. Children died in their mothers' arms. Corpses lay unburied. The government, aware of the catastrophe, did not respond with relief. Instead, it tightened grain requisitions, closed borders, and continued to export food abroad for profit. Officially, the famine was denied. Soviet newspapers remained silent. Foreign journalists who spoke of it were often discredited or expelled. The death toll remains a subject of debate, but conservative estimates suggest that between 4 to 7 million people died in Ukraine alone, with millions more across Kazakhstan, the North Caucasus, and other rural regions. Despite the horror, collectivization continued. By the mid-1930s, the vast majority of Soviet farms had been collectivized. The traditional peasant way of life, passed down for generations, had been forcibly dismantled. Many of the skilled farmers, the ones who had resisted most fiercely, were now dead or imprisoned. Agricultural output declined sharply in the years that followed, contributing to ongoing food shortages. Yet in the official narrative, collectivization was a triumph. State propaganda showed radiant peasants harvesting golden fields beneath red flags. Children learned songs about tractors and socialist labor. Soviet leaders declared the countryside liberated from exploitation, ignorance, and superstition. The suffering was not only hidden, it was rewritten, and the industrial engine rolled on. By the end of the first 5-year plan in 1932, the Soviet Union had made staggering gains. Steel production had tripled. Coal output had soared. New factories stretched across the map. Illiteracy was plummeting. The country that had once been mocked by Western observers as backward and primitive was now a rising power, vast, disciplined, and increasingly formidable. But at what cost? Millions had perished from starvation, disease, and forced labor. Thousands had been executed or exiled. Fear had become a part of everyday life. The state now controlled not just the economy, but the very rhythms of daily existence, what people could say, eat, grow, sell, or think. And still, Stalin demanded more. The second 5-year plan launched in 1933. followed by a third in 1938. Each one built upon the last, refining targets, expanding factories, tightening control. Entire industries were nationalized. Private trade, briefly allowed under NEP, disappeared. The state's reach extended into every village, every factory, every school. Through it all, Stalin's cult of personality grew. Posters, poems, speeches, and films elevated him to near-divine status. The wise leader, the father of nations, the architect of Soviet progress. His image appeared on coins, in classrooms, in government offices, in the hearts of those too afraid to question. Yet behind the slogans of progress, a darker truth was growing. One of purges, paranoia, and absolute control. The foundation had been laid. The people had been shaped. The Soviet Union was no longer a dream or a theory. It was real. And it was marching toward an uncertain future, powered by steel, fear, and belief. The Great Purge and the Cult of Personality. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union had become unrecognizable from the fractured, war-torn nation it had been just over a decade earlier. Gigantic factories now stood where farmland once stretched to the horizon. The hammer and sickle flew over every government building. Electricity flowed into the furthest villages. Trains rumbled across new tracks cut through forest, steppe, and snow. From the outside, it looked like a miracle of planning and progress. A country transformed by iron will and collective effort. A working-class utopia under construction. But beneath the surface, another transformation had taken place. One that was far more silent and far more dangerous. This was no longer a state ruled by a party. It was a state ruled by a single man, Joseph Stalin. He was no longer just General Secretary or Comrade Stalin. He had become something else entirely. A figure above politics, above reproach, above reality. His image was omnipresent. His words were memorized like scripture. His face stared down from walls, coins, murals, and statues. Children wrote poems to him. Artists painted him taller, stronger, more handsome than he had ever been. His name was spoken with reverence and fear. And as his legend grew, so too did his suspicion. Stalin believed in loyalty, not earned, but enforced. He distrusted those who remembered a time before his rise, and especially those who had once been his comrades. Many of them were intellectuals, revolutionaries, or military heroes with independent thoughts and independent influence. To Stalin, this made them dangerous. And so, between 1936 and 1938, the Soviet Union was plunged into one of the darkest periods in its history, a systematic campaign of terror and purging that would come to be known as the Great Purge, or the Great Terror. The purge did not begin all at once. It began slowly, quietly, almost surgically. At first, a few arrests, then a few confessions, then trials, dramatic, orchestrated, and public. In 1936, the first major show trial took place in Moscow. Former high-ranking Bolsheviks, once revered heroes of the revolution, were accused of treason, sabotage, espionage, and even murder. Men like Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, who had stood beside Lenin, were forced to confess to crimes they had not committed. Their confessions were broadcast, printed, and read aloud in schools. The message was clear. Even the founders of the revolution were not safe. They were executed shortly afterward. The trials were farcical in nature. Confessions extracted through torture, threats to family, sleep deprivation, and relentless psychological pressure. The accused admitted to impossible conspiracies, such as plotting with foreign governments or working secretly with exiled rivals like Leon Trotsky, who was now in Mexico, still defiant, still publishing essays warning of Stalin's tyranny. But the confessions didn't need to be true. They only needed to be useful. More trials followed. In 1937 and 1938, Wave after wave of arrests swept through the military, the Communist Party, the civil service, universities, factories, and the arts. Even the secret police, the NKVD, purged their own. No one was immune. Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, orchestrated much of the purge. He created quotas for arrests, interrogations, and executions, targets to be met not based on evidence but on suspicion. Regional officials, fearing accusations themselves, overfulfilled these quotas, arresting anyone who might be seen as ideologically impure, politically suspect, or simply inconvenient. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Colleagues turned on one another. Children informed on parents. Entire apartment buildings in Moscow emptied overnight. Doors left hanging open, belongings untouched. People vanished. Those arrested were often taken at night. Black cars, known as Black Mariahs, would arrive silently. A knock at the door, a search, a signature, a departure. Many never returned. Some were sent to prison. Others were transported to the sprawling network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag, a shadow empire stretching across the Arctic, Siberia, and the Far East. There, in frozen forests and windswept plains, prisoners dug canals by hand, mined coal with primitive tools, built railroads through permafrost. Conditions were inhumane, food was scarce, death was common. Torture wasn't reserved only for interrogation rooms. It lived in the daily routines of camp life, in hunger, in frostbite, in endless labor with no end in sight. And always, behind the suffering, loomed the propaganda. The state's machinery of narrative control operated with cold precision. Newspapers hailed the trials as heroic efforts to cleanse the party. Films portrayed the accused as saboteurs and foreign spies. Schools taught that vigilance was a virtue, that enemies of the people could hide in any face, wear any uniform, speak any language. Stalin was painted not as the architect of the purge, but as its savior, the tireless father figure protecting the Soviet people from the dangers lurking within. The paradox became the foundation of his cult. Stalin created the fear, then offered himself as the only protection from it. Every speech he gave was thunderously applauded. Every silence from him was interpreted as wisdom. His birthday was celebrated like a national holiday. Cities were renamed in his honor. Poems were written comparing him to the sun, the stars, the beating heart of the nation. But while Stalin stood at the center of this adoration, he remained largely unseen. Paranoid and controlling, he trusted almost no one. He moved between residences. He had food tasters, loyal guards, and multiple dachas. He surrounded himself with a small circle of officials who lived under constant anxiety, knowing that a whisper from the leader could spell their end. Among them were men like Vyacheslav Molotov, Lazar Kaganovich, Andrei Zhdanov, each powerful in their own right, each utterly loyal to Stalin. Those who faltered were erased, not only from office, but from history. Photographs were altered, textbooks rewritten, names forgotten. This atmosphere of erasure extended far beyond politics. Artists, writers, composers, and scientists were all expected to serve the state. Socialist realism became the mandatory style. Art that glorified the working class, celebrated industrial success, and placed Stalin at the moral center of all progress. Those who deviated were labeled as formalists, decadents, or enemies of the people. Some were silenced. Others were sent to camps. A few, unable to reconcile their inner world with the imposed narrative, took their own lives. Fear seeped into the most intimate corners of daily life. People learned not to speak their minds, even at home. Children learned to avoid certain questions. Teachers taught obedience more than knowledge. Workers performed rituals of loyalty to the state each morning before picking up their tools. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Great Purge was not just the numbers. The estimated 750,000 to 1.2 million people executed, or the millions more imprisoned or exiled. It was the silence left behind. Entire generations of thinkers, leaders, officers, and visionaries were lost. The Red Army, gutted by purges, would face grave consequences in the years to come. The party, once alive with debate and theory, became an echo chamber of agreement. Independent thought had not only been punished, it had been made impossible. And yet, amid the silence, the Soviet Union continued to grow. New factories opened, infrastructure expanded, literacy rose, cities swelled. The 5-year plans continued, with revised targets and grander goals. To outsiders, the USSR seemed like a nation moving forward at relentless speed. But forward toward what? In truth, the country had been reshaped not just in industry or policy, but in the minds of its people. Loyalty had replaced belief. Obedience had replaced trust. The revolution that had begun with dreams of equality had calcified into a state of absolute control, not because it failed to modernize, but because it had done so through terror. By the end of the 1930s, Stalin stood alone atop a government built on ash and silence. The purges had ended, not with apology, but with quiet exhaustion. Those responsible were themselves purged. Yezhov, the chief of the NKVD, once feared across the country, was arrested, tortured, and executed in 1940. His image was later airbrushed out of official photographs, as if he had never existed. The state moved on, but the scars remained. And as Europe drifted toward the brink of another world war, the Soviet Union stood like a monolith, immense, unbending, and watchful. Its factories roared, its children marched, and above them all, one man watched. Stalin, the man of steel, the architect of terror, the father of the Soviet people. He had remade a nation, but at what price? The Second World War, the Eastern Front. By the close of the 1930s, Europe trembled on the edge of collapse. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, promising to undo the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, to reclaim lost territory, and to build a new German empire, one rooted in racial ideology and unrelenting conquest. His eyes turned eastward, toward vast lands, rich resources, and what he saw as inferior peoples. In his vision of Lebensraum, living space, the Slavic populations of Eastern Europe, including Russians, Ukrainians, and Poles, were obstacles to be removed or enslaved. And yet, in a move that shocked the world, Hitler and Stalin signed a treaty. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, was a non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Publicly, it promised peace. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Days later, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. The Soviets invaded from the east. The Second World War had begun. For nearly 2 years, the Soviet Union remained officially neutral. While Britain and France battled the Axis in the west, the Soviets moved quietly, annexing the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and pushing into parts of Finland and Romania. Soviet troops advanced behind diplomatic smiles. Stalin did not trust Hitler, but he believed he had bought time. He was wrong. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. More than 3 million German soldiers, backed by hundreds of thousands of Axis allies, tanks, aircraft, and artillery, stormed across the Soviet border. They came in 3 prongs: north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, south toward the resource-rich lands of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Red Army was unprepared. Stalin, ignoring warnings from his own intelligence and from foreign sources, had not believed Hitler would attack so soon. Soviet defenses were incomplete. Aircraft sat on runways. Units lacked supplies. Commanders were hesitant to act without orders. and Stalin, stunned, went silent for days. In the opening weeks, the Wehrmacht tore through Soviet lines. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured. Entire divisions were wiped out. Cities fell. The skies were filled with the roar of Stuka dive bombers and the black smoke of burning towns. By autumn, German troops had advanced hundreds of miles, seizing Minsk, Smolensk, and approaching the gates of Moscow itself. And yet, something began to shift. The further the Germans pushed, the longer their supply lines stretched. The roads were poor. The autumn rains turned dirt into impassable mud. A season the Russians call Rasputitsa. Still, the advance continued. Moscow braced for invasion. Stalin refused to evacuate. Instead, he stayed in the capital and gave a defiant speech in Red Square as troops paraded before him, heading directly to the front. Then came the winter. The temperature dropped sharply. Snow fell in waves. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms, froze in trenches. Engines failed. Guns jammed. Frostbite spread like wildfire. The Soviets, hardened by harsh winters, counterattacked. Fresh divisions arrived from the east, troops that Stalin had redeployed only after securing a neutrality pact with Japan. The Germans were pushed back from Moscow. It was the first major failure of Hitler's war, and it would not be the last. In the north, the German advance stalled outside Leningrad, Stalin's symbolic city, named for the father of the revolution. Rather than storm it outright, Hitler ordered a siege. He intended to starve the city into submission, and so began the siege of Leningrad, which would last 872 days. Nearly 2.5 years of hunger, isolation, and unimaginable endurance. The city was surrounded. Supply lines were cut. Food dwindled. In the first winter alone, hundreds of thousands died from starvation, exposure, and disease. People ate wallpaper paste, sawdust bread, and, in the worst moments, their pets, even each other. Entire families perished in their apartments, yet the city refused to fall. On frozen Lake Ladoga, nicknamed the Road of Life, trucks ferried food and supplies under constant bombardment. In summer, boats crossed the lake. In winter, they drove across the ice. Civilians dug trenches, manned anti-aircraft guns, and composed music in the dark. Dmitri Shostakovich, trapped in the city, wrote his 7th symphony amid the bombardment, a haunting tribute to defiance. Leningrad survived, but the cost was staggering. Over 1 million civilian deaths, making it one of the deadliest sieges in history. In the south, the Germans captured Kiev and advanced deep into Ukraine, where many welcomed them at first as liberators from Stalin's terror and famine. But that illusion shattered quickly. Einsatzgruppen, Nazi death squads, followed the Wehrmacht, carrying out mass executions of Jews, communists, and other undesirables. At Babi Yar, outside Kiev, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. By 1942, Hitler turned his gaze further south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and the city that bore his rival's name, Stalingrad. It would become the site of one of the most ferocious battles in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad began in the summer of 1942 and raged for nearly 6 months. German forces bombed the city into rubble, then moved street by street, building by building. Soviet troops clung to every inch. They fought from basements, burned out factories, and shattered stairwells. Snipers hid among the debris. Combat was so close that tanks fired at point-blank range. Stalin ordered a policy of not one step back. Soviet units were forbidden to retreat. Penal battalions, composed of prisoners and cowards, were sent on suicidal assaults. Deserters were shot. Civilians were drafted into militias. Then, in November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement maneuver that trapped the German Sixth Army inside the city. Supplies were cut. Temperatures dropped. The Germans starved and froze. Hitler ordered them to hold. No surrender. But in February 1943, after months of agony, the German commander, Friedrich Paulus, surrendered. Over 300,000 Axis troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The tide of war had turned. From that point forward, the Soviet Union went on the offensive. In 1943, the Red Army fought the massive tank battle at Kursk, the largest armored clash in history. German forces were defeated again. Soviet production, now in overdrive, was outpacing German industry. New tanks, aircraft, and weapons poured from Soviet factories. Many relocated to the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers. City by city, the Soviets reclaimed their territory. By 1944, Ukraine was liberated. Belarus followed. The Red Army pushed westward through Poland, the Baltics, and the Balkans. As they advanced, Soviet soldiers encountered the horrors of the Holocaust: mass graves, extermination camps, and death in every form. At Majdanek and later Auschwitz, they found what no one had imagined: industrialized murder. Soviet losses had been staggering. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. Whole towns vanished. Villages were leveled. Families were erased. But still, they advanced. By early 1945, the Red Army reached Germany. They crossed the Oder River. Artillery thundered across the plains. Berlin lay ahead. The Battle of Berlin began in April. It was the final, brutal push. Street fighting, air raids, artillery bombardments. The German capital crumbled under relentless pressure. Soviet troops fought block by block, chasing the remnants of Hitler's shattered regime. On May 2nd, 1945, Berlin fell. Hitler was dead. Nazi Germany surrendered days later. The red flag was raised over the Reichstag, the symbol of Soviet victory, flown high over the ruins of the Third Reich. Victory Day, May 9th, became a sacred date in Soviet memory. Streets filled with celebration. Cities held parades. Stalin was hailed as the architect of victory. His image, already ubiquitous, became synonymous with triumph. But the cost of victory was almost beyond comprehension. Entire cities, Smolensk, Kursk, Stalingrad, Kiev, Minsk, lay in ruins. Bridges, power plants, factories, and railroads had been destroyed. Entire generations had vanished. Villages were razed, fields left barren. And the people were exhausted, broken, grieving. Yet they had survived. The Soviet Union emerged from the war not only victorious, but transformed. It had defeated fascism, captured Berlin, and stood now as one of the two global superpowers. But this new position would bring new tensions. For in the ashes of Berlin, the seeds of another conflict were already being sown. The Cold War was about to begin. In May 1945, the guns finally fell silent. Across the shattered cities of Europe, smoke still hung in the air. Roads were broken. Bridges lay in rivers. Churches stood roofless, their bells silent. The war had ended, but the wounds were deep and raw. Everywhere people emerged from hiding, thin, pale, grieving. Soldiers wept in the streets. Families searched the ruins for names that had long since disappeared. But in one vast, weary land, the taste of victory was both bitter and immense. The Soviet Union had survived. More than that, it had won. From the smoldering streets of Berlin to the blackened rubble of Warsaw, the red flag now flew. Soviet troops stood guard over a defeated Germany. Soviet influence stretched across Eastern Europe. The nation that had once been underestimated, encircled, and attacked had emerged as one of the two great powers shaping the new world. But the cost had been staggering. The Soviet Union had lost an estimated 27 million people during the war. Cities like Stalingrad, Minsk, Kiev, and Smolensk were nearly erased from the map. Over 70,000 villages were burned, destroyed, or abandoned. Schools, libraries, factories, and entire hospitals had vanished. Roads were reduced to rutted trails. Fields had been mined, salted, or left fallow. It was not merely a victory, it was survival against annihilation. And now came the question, what next? Joseph Stalin, the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union, had no intention of retreating into isolation. The war had proved more than just the power of the Red Army. It had shown the strength of the Soviet model, at least in the minds of those who shaped it. Stalin envisioned not merely reconstruction, but expansion, a reshaping of the post-war world along lines favorable to Soviet interests, security, and ideology. Even before the war had ended, the future had begun to take shape. At Yalta, and later at Potsdam, the Allied leaders, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met to discuss the fate of post-war Europe. Borders were redrawn, zones of occupation were assigned. Germany would be divided. So too would Berlin. But more subtly, a sphere of influence was forming, one in which the Soviet Union would dominate the political future of Eastern Europe. By 1945, Soviet troops occupied not only Eastern Germany, but also Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Though each had its own government, its own people, and its own identity, the presence of Soviet soldiers and Soviet expectations became the defining force in their immediate future. In the months and years that followed, one by one, these countries underwent political transformation. Coalition governments were formed, but the communists, often a minority, were backed by Soviet influence, intelligence agencies, and pressure. Opposition leaders were arrested. Newspapers were silenced. Elections were held, but always with predetermined results. Parties merged or disappeared. Within a few years, the region had been remade into a buffer zone, a belt of people's republics that pledged loyalty to Moscow. The Eastern Bloc had been born. At home, meanwhile, the Soviet Union embarked on an immense program of reconstruction. The land was devastated, but the government launched into the task with urgency and force. A new 5-year plan was announced, this time not to prepare for war, but to recover from it. Steel mills were rebuilt. Bridges were reassembled. Entire cities were reconstructed using standardized designs, with broad boulevards, grey apartment blocks, and central squares built for parades. Schools reopened. Railways were repaired. The Volga-Don Canal was dug by hand through forced labor. Thousands of industrial enterprises, dismantled and relocated during the war, returned to their original sites. The scale of the work was enormous, and so too was the sacrifice. Resources were diverted from consumption to production. Consumer goods were scarce. Rationing continued. Workers were expected to endure long hours under harsh conditions. And yet, by the late 1940s, Soviet production had reached and surpassed pre-war levels. But this was not just about steel and electricity. It was about proving the model, demonstrating to the world and to its own citizens that the Soviet system was not only viable, but superior. The West had its markets and its empires. The USSR had its plans, its discipline, and its vision of collective progress. Stalin's propaganda machine roared to life once again. Posters showed workers smiling in hard hats. Murals celebrated wartime heroism and post-war industry. Films portrayed Stalin as the brilliant strategist who had led the country through darkness. Textbooks were rewritten to elevate his role and diminish that of others. History was not recorded. It was curated, designed to teach loyalty, strength, and eternal vigilance. Because though the war had ended, a new conflict was beginning. In the West, especially in the United States and Britain, alarm was growing over Soviet actions in Eastern Europe. What had once been allies in war were now adversaries in peace. The ideological divide was clear. The Americans and British championed liberal democracy, capitalism, and free markets. The Soviets promoted socialism, centralized planning, and one-party rule. By 1947, this tension had a name: the Cold War. Though no formal declaration was made, the world quietly divided. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously described it, descended across the continent. To the west, NATO would rise. To the east, the Warsaw Pact would later answer. But in these first post-war years, the lines were just beginning to be drawn. The Soviet Union projected its power abroad carefully, but deliberately. In Iran, Soviet troops initially refused to withdraw after the war, pressing for influence in the oil-rich north. In Greece, the USSR quietly supported communist guerrillas. In Turkey, pressure mounted over control of the Bosporus. Stalin tested the boundaries, watching how far he could push without provoking direct confrontation. At the same time, he looked inward. The late 1940s saw a renewed focus on ideological purification. The war had opened windows, cultural, artistic, and intellectual. Foreign literature, jazz music, and scientific collaboration had briefly flourished. But now, the shutters were slammed shut. A new cultural crackdown began. Writers and artists were accused of cosmopolitanism, a vague crime often synonymous with being Jewish, foreign-influenced, or insufficiently patriotic. Books were banned, theaters were censored. Science itself was not immune. The field of genetics, for example, was overtaken by Trofim Lysenko, whose pseudo-scientific ideas were promoted by Stalin and enforced through political loyalty rather than empirical results. Countless scientists were fired, imprisoned, or worse. Stalin's control became total. He rarely appeared in public, but his presence was constant. His face loomed in schools, post offices, farms, and government buildings. Streets were renamed in his honor. Cities bore his name. Newspapers reported his thoughts on everything from poetry to agriculture. Loyalty to the leader became indistinguishable from loyalty to the state. Meanwhile, the Soviet people tried to rebuild their lives. For millions, that meant beginning again with nothing. Widows raised children alone. Veterans returned to find their homes gone. Orphans wandered the countryside. Yet despite the devastation, there was also pride. Pride in having endured. Pride in having defeated the Nazis. Pride in being part of something vast and historical. The Red Army, once a force of defense, now became a force of projection. Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe ensured that friendly regimes remained in power, and that rebellion, when it emerged, could be swiftly suppressed. The world was watching. In 1949, two events changed the balance of power. First, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed, a military alliance of Western democracies designed to contain the spread of Soviet influence. Second, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, a seismic shift in global politics. No longer did the United States hold a monopoly on nuclear power. The world had entered a new age, an age of mutually assured destruction, of spies and satellites, of proxy wars and ideological battles fought on every continent. By the dawn of the 1950s, the Soviet Union stood as a true superpower. It was massive, nuclear-armed, and ideologically driven. Its borders stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. Its cities were rebuilt. Its army was unmatched in size. Its sphere of influence encompassed nearly half of Europe. But beneath the steel and granite, cracks remained. The wounds of war still ached. The gulags still operated. Fear still lingered. And though Stalin's image stood tall in marble and memory, he was now an old man, increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid, increasingly convinced that enemies lurked in every shadow. The victory was real, the power undeniable, but peace, real, open peace, would remain elusive. The Cold War begins. The guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, but peace had not settled over the world. It lingered in name only. A thin, uncertain calm stretched over a deep and growing divide. Beneath the surface of treaties and parades, a new conflict had begun to take shape. A war without front lines. A war without declared enemies. A war fought in shadows, strategies, and silent skies. This was the Cold War, not born in a single moment, but gradually, inevitably, from the ashes of the last great conflict. In the years immediately following 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the two dominant powers on Earth. But they could not have been more different. The Soviet Union, centrally planned, one-party ruled, deeply ideological, viewed the capitalist West as inherently exploitative and a threat to socialism. The United States, democratic, market-driven, shaped by individual freedoms, saw the spread of communism as an existential danger to liberty itself. This wasn't just about power, it was about belief. Each side claimed to offer the better future. Each believed the other would stop at nothing to dominate the world. And so, the alliances that had held firm during wartime dissolved, not with an explosion, but with a deepening frost. The first signs were subtle. In Eastern Europe, Soviet influence hardened. Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany saw their political landscapes reshaped. Though elections were promised, they were managed. Opposition voices vanished. Borders were tightened. Communist parties, backed by Moscow, assumed total control. These countries were not absorbed, but they were aligned. Economically, militarily, and ideologically. To the West, this looked like aggression, an empire in all but name. In 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, speaking from the American heartland, uttered the phrase that would define the age. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. It was not just a metaphor, it was a warning. In response, the United States adopted a new strategy: containment. The goal was not to roll back Soviet power, but to prevent its further expansion. The world, it seemed, was now a chessboard, every square contested. In 1947, the US announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to countries resisting communist pressure. Not long after, it launched the Marshall Plan, a massive program of economic aid to rebuild Western Europe. Billions of dollars flowed into France, West Germany, Italy, and others. The intention was clear. Prosperity would prevent the appeal of communism. The Soviet Union, seeing this as an attempt to buy loyalty, rejected the Marshall Plan outright and forced its allies to do the same. Instead, it created its own version of economic integration, COMCON, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Lines were being drawn. The city of Berlin, deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, became a flashpoint. Though the city had been divided into sectors after the war, it was still a single, open metropolis. Western and Eastern influences lived side by side, separated more by ideology than by walls. But in 1948, the Soviets blocked all land and rail access to West Berlin in an effort to force the Allies out. Roads were sealed, supplies were cut off. The city, home to over 2 million, faced starvation. In response, the West launched the Berlin Airlift, one of the most remarkable logistical efforts in history. For nearly a year, planes landed every few minutes, day and night, delivering food, fuel, medicine, and hope. More than 200,000 flights kept the city alive. Eventually, the Soviets lifted the blockade, but the message was clear. The world had changed. In 1949, the West formalized its alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. 12 nations pledged mutual defense. An attack on one would be an attack on all. It was the first peacetime military alliance in US history, and a signal to the Soviets that the West would not back down. Later, in 1955, the Soviet Union responded with its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, binding Eastern Bloc nations into a formal military pact under Soviet command. Europe was now fully divided, not just in politics or economy, but in arms, uniforms, and command chains. And then came the bomb. The United States had ended the Second World War with atomic fire. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had revealed the terrible new power of science. For 4 years, America held the monopoly. But in August 1949, that changed. In a remote region of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device, RDS-1. The world had entered a new, more dangerous age. Nuclear weapons changed everything. War, once waged with bullets and bombs, could now end civilization in hours. Cities could vanish in a single flash. And so began the arms race, a contest of escalation that would span decades. By the early 1950s, both superpowers possessed hydrogen bombs, even more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. Bombers circled the skies, submarines patrolled the oceans, missiles stood ready in silos beneath fields and forests. Each side developed doctrines of deterrence, strategies based on mutual destruction. The idea was not to win a nuclear war, but to ensure that no one dared start one. The term AD, mutually assured destruction, entered the military lexicon. It was, in essence, a doctrine of fear. Fear shaped the decade. Civilians in both blocs practiced duck and cover drills. Fallout shelters were dug beneath city blocks. Children learned about radiation before they learned algebra. Artists painted mushroom clouds. Writers imagined apocalyptic futures. The Cold War was not just fought in embassies and military bases. It was fought in the imagination. Propaganda became a second battlefield. In the West, the Soviet Union was portrayed as a brutal dictatorship, grey, repressive, joyless. In the USSR, America was painted as a land of greed, racism, and imperialism. Both narratives had truth. Both were shaped to serve agendas. In Moscow, the Kremlin tightened its grip. Dissent was silenced. Foreign broadcasts were jammed. Border crossings were monitored. The Soviet people were told they lived in the most advanced, just on Earth. Alternative perspectives were treasonous. And yet, many citizens still believed, not always in the state, but in something deeper, in peace, in justice, in the promise that their sacrifice, their labor, their dreams, had built something worthwhile. The trauma of war still lived in every family. For some, obedience wasn't fear, it was loyalty born from pain. In Washington, fear of communism began to grow into paranoia. The Red Scare swept through the United States. Senators like Joseph McCarthy accused hundreds of Americans of being Soviet agents. Artists, scientists, and government workers were blacklisted, interrogated, and ruined, often without evidence. Espionage trials dominated headlines. Spies were real, men like Klaus Fuchs, who passed atomic secrets to the Soviets. But the fear far exceeded the facts. In both East and West, truth became slippery. Power wore masks. Yet even amid the frost, there were moments of contact. In Geneva, Paris, and Vienna, diplomats met. Treaties were drafted. Cultural exchanges brought ballet companies and jazz musicians across the divide. Scientists attended conferences together. Letters crossed oceans. But trust never came easily. In the Soviet Union, Stalin remained the unchallenged leader. But he was aging. More isolated, more paranoid, more suspicious of even his closest allies. He feared traitors, plots, and invisible enemies. Ministers were arrested, generals were demoted, whispers became facts. And then, in March 1953, he died. Officially, he had suffered a stroke. Unofficially, rumors swirled that doctors had been delayed, that guards had been afraid to enter his room, that silence had surrounded the most powerful man in the country in his final hours. His death marked the end of an era. Stalin had shaped the Soviet Union with an iron will. He had survived Lenin, defeated Hitler, and faced down the West. But his reign had also left scars, purges, gulags, and a culture of silence. Now, as his body lay in state in Moscow, millions filed past to pay their respects. Some mourned, others breathed quietly, afraid still of being overheard. A new chapter was about to begin. The Cold War would not end with Stalin. It would evolve, shaped by new leaders, new crises, and new technologies. The space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, proxy wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The struggle would continue, not through direct conflict, but through pressure, posture, and perpetual brinkmanship. But in these early years, just after the bombs, the speeches, and the descent of the Iron Curtain, the Cold War had already changed the world. It had divided it. It had defined it. And it was only just beginning. Khrushchev's Thaw and the space race. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, a stillness fell across the Soviet Union. For nearly 3 decades, he had ruled with absolute authority. His death was not just the end of a life. It was the unraveling of an entire structure of fear, obedience, and unquestioned power. His body lay in state in the Hall of Columns, under crystal chandeliers, draped in red velvet and surrounded by flowers. People wept. Some fainted. Others, quietly, dared to exhale. But beneath the official mourning, something had already begun to shift. There was no clear successor. Stalin had never named one. He had ruled as a solitary figure, preferring rivalry beneath him to prevent any threat from rising. And so, after his death, a power struggle ensued, not with tanks or violence, but with whispers, alliances, and cautious steps behind closed Kremlin doors. For a brief moment, collective leadership returned. 3 men, Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Nikita Khrushchev, emerged as contenders. Beria, the feared head of the secret police, moved quickly to consolidate power. He spoke of reforms, of easing repression, of loosening Stalin's grip, but no one trusted him. Within months, he was arrested and executed, accused of treason, sabotage, and conspiracy. His fall was as sudden as it was silent. In time, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev emerged as the new face of Soviet leadership. Unlike Stalin, Khrushchev was gregarious, blunt, and unpolished. He had grown up poor, worked in mines and factories, and risen through the ranks not through fear, but through loyalty and pragmatism. He lacked Stalin's mystique, but he possessed something Stalin had buried, a willingness to rethink. And rethink he did. In 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, Khrushchev delivered one of the most shocking speeches in Soviet history, not to the public, but to a closed session of party delegates. The world would come to know it as the secret speech. In it, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's cult of personality, the purges, the mass arrests, and the abuse of power. He called Stalin's rule a betrayal of Leninist ideals. He spoke of fear, lies, and terror. The room sat in stunned silence. Some wept, others fainted. For decades, Stalin had been a godlike figure. Now, his image was being dismantled, not by enemies, but by his own successors. The speech was never published officially, but it was leaked, whispered, copied, and passed hand to hand across the globe. The impact was seismic. Across the Soviet Union, statues were taken down, streets renamed, Gulag prisoners were released, textbooks were rewritten. A new word entered the Soviet vocabulary: de-Stalinization. This was the beginning of Khrushchev's Thaw, a period of relative openness, experimentation, and cautious reform. Censorship was relaxed, not abolished, but loosened. Writers once silenced could now publish again. Films explored human emotion, ambiguity, even subtle criticism. Art, long bound by the strict rules of socialist realism, began to breathe. The poetry of Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the novels of Vasily Grossman, and the short stories of Alexander Solzhenitsyn began to circulate, some legally, some secretly. Ordinary citizens, too, felt the change. Letters became less guarded. Jokes returned to kitchen tables. People dared, quietly, to question. Not openly, not recklessly. But the silence was no longer absolute. Khrushchev also sought to shift the economy. Heavy industry remained dominant, but greater attention was paid to agriculture and consumer goods. He launched the Virgin Lands campaign, sending thousands of young volunteers to Kazakhstan and Siberia to cultivate previously unused land. For a time, it worked, but poor planning, drought, and soil exhaustion led to setbacks. Still, the effort signaled a new ambition: to raise living standards, to feed the people, to modernize not just tanks and factories, but homes and lives. And then, in 1957, something rose into the sky and changed the world forever. From the remote steppes of Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Soviet Union launched a small metallic sphere into orbit. It was called Sputnik 1, and it became the first artificial satellite to circle the Earth. It weighed just 184 pounds, emitted a faint radio signal, and orbited the planet every 96 minutes. But its psychological impact was enormous. To the West, it was a shock. The Soviet Union, often portrayed as backward or sluggish, had beaten the United States into space. It wasn't just a scientific triumph. It was a demonstration of technological prowess, missile capability, and ideological confidence. The space race had begun. Within months, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying a living passenger, Laika, a stray dog from the streets of Moscow. She became the first creature to orbit Earth. Though she died during the flight, she became a symbol, not just of Soviet science, but of ambition that knew no limits. Then, in 1961, another milestone. Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old pilot from a small village near Smolensk, became the first human in space. His spacecraft, Vostok 1, completed one orbit of Earth in just under 2 hours. When he returned, he was a national hero. His smile plastered on posters, coins, and stamps. Across the globe, his name was whispered with awe. Poyakali, let's go, had been his launch phrase. It became a slogan of an era. Khrushchev basked in the triumph. He toured factories with Gagarin. He presented him to world leaders. The Soviet Union had not only caught up with the West, it had, in the heavens at least, overtaken it. But the Cold War was never far behind. The space race was one front. Berlin was another. In the early 1960s, East Germany was bleeding people. Thousands fleeing daily from the communist East to the capitalist West through the open city of Berlin. It was a hemorrhage that threatened the entire Eastern Bloc. In 1961, the East German government, with Soviet backing, erected a wall, not to keep people out, but to keep them in. The Berlin Wall rose overnight. Barbed wire, concrete, and armed guards divided families, streets, and entire lives. It became the most visible symbol of the Cold War, a scar across a city, a line between freedom and control. And then came Cuba. In 1959, a revolution led by Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed government of Fulgencio Batista. At first, the Soviet Union watched cautiously, but when the new Cuban leadership turned away from Washington and toward Moscow, Khrushchev saw an opportunity. Cuba was just 90 miles from the American coast, a perfect place to balance US missiles in Turkey and Italy. In 1962, Soviet ships began delivering nuclear weapons to Cuba in secret, but American spy planes saw them. What followed became the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its breath. US President John F. Kennedy demanded the missiles be removed. Soviet ships steamed toward the naval blockade. Military forces were placed on high alert. Nuclear war, real, final, and global, seemed just one miscalculation away. Then, quietly, a deal was reached. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States pledged not to invade the island, and later, secretly, agreed to withdraw its own missiles from Turkey. The world exhaled, but the damage to Khrushchev's prestige was done. Many in the Soviet leadership saw the retreat as weakness, a gamble that nearly ended in disaster. His position, once secure, began to slip. Still, Khrushchev pressed on. He visited the United States, famously pounding his shoe at the United Nations. He toured American farms. He debated capitalism with Vice President Richard Nixon in a televised kitchen debate. He was brash, impulsive, and often unpolished, but he humanized Soviet leadership in ways Stalin never had. At home, however, the economy was faltering. His agricultural reforms had mixed results. Industrial targets lagged, and by 1964, the party had lost patience. That October, Khrushchev was quietly removed from power. There were no purges, no executions. He was given a pension, a country house, and a gentle fading from public life. It was the end of the Thaw, yet Khrushchev's impact endured. He had dared to speak the truth about Stalin. He had opened windows, however briefly. He had sent humanity into space. He had faced down nuclear war and pulled the world back from the brink. And though the Cold War would continue, with new faces and deeper shadows, the sky had been broken open. A human had looked down on Earth from the stars. For a moment, amid the silence of orbit, the rivalries seemed very small, and the future, distant, fragile, beautiful, stretched out beneath. Everyday life in the Soviet Union. Beyond the marches in Red Square, beyond the headlines, beyond the speeches and slogans and parades, there was something quieter, something softer and more human. There was life. Life in the Soviet Union unfolded in small apartments, in cold kitchens, on tree-lined boulevards and dusty rural paths. It played out in early mornings and long queues, in whispered jokes and steaming tea glasses, in laughter, weariness, hope, and compromise. For the vast majority of Soviet citizens, the daily rhythm was not about ideology or geopolitics. It was about living, feeding the family, doing a job, raising children, and finding small joys in a system that often felt impossibly large. The typical day began early. In cities like Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev, alarms buzzed in identical apartments, small box-like spaces known as Khrushchevkas, built quickly and efficiently during the post-war years. These 5-story buildings, often made from grey concrete panels, were uniform and functional. Families shared cramped quarters, 1 bedroom, sometimes 2, a narrow kitchen, a tiny bathroom. In many cases, several generations lived under the same roof. There was little privacy, walls were thin, neighbors were close. In older buildings, especially before the 1960s, communal apartments, kommunalkas, were common. Multiple families might share 1 kitchen, 1 hallway, 1 bathroom. The spaces were divided by curtains, agreements, and habit. Still, these apartments were home. A pot of tea on the stove, a radio on the windowsill, potted plants lining the ledge, embroidered towels, family photos, jars of pickled vegetables, and stacks of books gave each flat a distinct character. Mornings were brisk. Adults dressed quickly, often in modest but carefully maintained clothes. Workplaces had uniforms, expectations. Children in school uniforms, white shirts, red scarves, navy skirts or slacks, ate kasha or black bread with butter before heading to school, often on foot. The school day began with a short ceremony, a flag, an anthem, a reminder that they were building the future. For most Soviet citizens, work was central to life. Jobs were guaranteed. Every adult had a role. You were a nurse, a tram operator, a factory worker, a teacher, an engineer, a cleaner, a librarian, a radio technician. Titles mattered, but not for wealth. Salaries were modest and relatively flat. A surgeon earned more than a janitor, but not extravagantly so. Prestige was measured more by respect than income. Men and women worked side by side. The Soviet Union promoted gender equality in the workforce early on. Women could be welders, pilots, chemists, or construction foremen. Still, they were often expected to shoulder domestic duties too, balancing work with childcare, cooking, and laundry. Lunch was eaten at work, usually in a stolovaya, a workplace canteen serving staples like soup, porridge, cabbage rolls, beet salad, or kotlety, fried meat patties. Meals were simple, hearty, and standardized. The rationing of goods had officially ended in the post-war years, but shortages remained common. Shopping was a central part of daily life, and often a challenge. In large cities, queues were a defining feature of the streetscape. People waited in long lines for fresh bread, milk, butter, sausage, or seasonal produce. If one person spotted a line forming, others would often join it, without knowing what was being sold. The assumption was simple. If there's a line, it must be something worth having. Grocery stores, product tea, stocked familiar basics. Kefir, eggs, pickles, rye bread, canned fish, sunflower oil. Imported goods were rare. Bananas, citrus fruits, and chocolate were occasional luxuries, often reserved for holidays. Toilet paper, nylon stockings, and good shoes could vanish from shelves for weeks. Outside the city, in rural villages, life followed a slower rhythm. Many still worked in collective farms or kolkhozes, planting and harvesting crops, tending livestock, mending fences, and working according to central plans and quotas. Villages were often small, with one general store, one school, one clinic, one bus stop. Wooden cottages with lace-trimmed windows, painted in blue and green, dotted the landscape. Wells stood at crossroads. Chickens wandered freely. People grew food in their gardens: potatoes, beets, cucumbers, cabbage. Almost every family had a small plot called a dacha, a summer house outside the city, often homemade and humble. Here, during warm months, families planted vegetables, stored firewood, and gathered mushrooms from the forest. Dachas were escapes, places of simplicity and peace. In the evenings, people returned home. Soviet television, though limited, became a fixture by the 1970s. Families gathered to watch news, films, or popular comedies. There were few channels, and broadcasts often ended early. The state controlled all programming, but even within those boundaries, viewers found favorites. New Pogodi, a Soviet cartoon about a wolf and a hare. 17 Moments of Spring, a drama about a spy during World War II. Or The Irony of Fate, a beloved New Year's comedy. Books, too, played a central role. Despite censorship, the Soviet Union was a deeply literary culture. Libraries were everywhere. Reading was considered noble, serious, enriching. Citizens devoured the classics: Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Soviet authors like Gorky, Sholokhov, or Mayakovsky. Poetry was memorized. Novels passed hand to hand. Some books were samizdat, typed copies of banned works, secretly shared between trusted friends. Music filled apartments and courtyards. Folk songs, classical compositions, and state-approved pop music flowed from radios. The Red Army Choir sang patriotic anthems. Tchaikovsky, Prokofiev, and Shostakovich filled concert halls. Yet hidden from official broadcasts was the sound of magnetizdat, illegal tape recordings of foreign rock music. Beatles records, Deep Purple, and Led Zeppelin albums made their way into Soviet hands, copied on reel-to-reel tape, shared in secret. People danced, people dreamed. Despite hardship, there was celebration. Holidays were important, markers of both tradition and state identity. New Year's Eve was the most beloved. A decorated tree, known as a yolka, stood in every home. Families gathered for food, laughter, and the televised countdown. At midnight, a toast, fireworks, champagne, a quiet moment of collective hope. May Day, the International Day of Workers, brought parades, banners, flowers, and songs. Children waved paper flags. Factories displayed achievements on posters. Workers marched in proud, orderly columns. On Victory Day, May 9th, war veterans wore their medals. Military bands played in city squares. The memory of sacrifice was honored, with wreaths laid at eternal flames. Even decades after the war, the pain remained close. Every family had lost someone. Despite the state's firm control, faith and tradition persisted in quiet ways. Churches were restricted but never forgotten. Baptisms took place quietly. Icons hung behind curtains. Easter eggs were painted in secret. Priests still served, often elderly, worn and watched. Marriage, love, friendship, and grief followed rhythms older than the revolution. People married young. Weddings were simple but joyful. In registry offices, followed by small celebrations with family, vodka, and dancing. Babies were born in state hospitals. Names were chosen carefully. Friends gathered for toasts, jokes, and the singing of old songs. Death, when it came, was marked with dignity. Black scarves, quiet cemeteries, and shared stories. There was sorrow, yes, but there was resilience too. And always, people found ways to live, not just survive. They gathered in kitchens late at night, sipping tea, talking about art, music, and sometimes politics. Carefully, always with trusted friends. They told jokes that poked fun at the system. Anecdote, short tales that carried sharp truths. One popular version went, "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work." Laughter, like poetry, was a quiet rebellion. And children, always, carried the future. They climbed trees, chased one another through courtyards, collected bottle caps, and dreamed of rockets. They learned chess in school, wore red pioneer scarves, recited poetry on stage, and watched snow fall from apartment windows with wonder. Everyday life in the Soviet Union was not a single story. It was millions of overlapping ones. It was hard. It was tender. It was filled with moments of absurdity and grace. It was life, human, stubborn, beautiful, lived under a sky of stars, beneath the weight of history, and always, somehow, moving forward. Brezhnev and the Era of Stagnation. After the impulsive energy of Nikita Khrushchev's years, with their sudden reforms, volatile speeches, and near brushes with nuclear war, the rise of Leonid Brezhnev brought something very different to the Soviet Union: stability. At first, that stability felt like a relief. Khrushchev had startled the party with his unpredictability. His Virgin Lands campaign had run into dust storms. His decentralization policies had irritated industrial leaders. His handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, though ultimately successful in avoiding war, had been seen as reckless. By 1964, the party quietly removed him, not with guns, not with trials, but with procedural votes and closed-door discussions. Into this opening stepped Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, solid, steady, and careful. Brezhnev did not seek to remake the Soviet Union overnight. He did not rail against Stalin, nor promise sweeping changes. Instead, he projected calm authority. He smiled often, spoke slowly, and emphasized unity, continuity, and pride. To the weary party elite, he seemed the perfect antidote to chaos. He would rule for the next 18 years, one of the longest periods of uninterrupted leadership in Soviet history. And with him came the era later known, with a sigh, with a shrug, as the Era of Stagnation. It did not begin as such. At first, Brezhnev's leadership focused on restoring discipline and predictability. Power was recentralized in Moscow. Reforms were slowed, reconsidered, or reversed. Khrushchev's erratic experiments in dividing ministries were undone. The military was reassured, industrial targets were refined, foreign policy was made more cautious. The Soviet Union, at this point, still appeared strong. It was a nuclear superpower. It had unmatched influence over Eastern Europe. Its space program remained impressive. Its citizens, though aware of shortages and inefficiencies, had access to education, jobs, housing, and pensions. The standard of living had risen compared to the Stalin era. Trains ran, hospitals functioned, the streets were orderly. But beneath the surface, cracks were widening. The Soviet economy, centrally planned, rigid, and deeply bureaucratic, had begun to slow. In earlier decades, the system had thrived on extensive growth. More inputs, more factories, more labor. But by the 1970s, the basic infrastructure had already been built. Now, what was needed was intensive growth, better efficiency, innovation, adaptability. And that was where the Soviet model began to falter. Production targets were still set from above. Quotas ruled everything. Ministries reported figures that pleased superiors, not reflected reality. Managers feared change. Mistakes were hidden, not fixed. Innovation was risky, not rewarded, but suspect. Factories churned out enormous quantities of goods, but quality often lagged. Tractors broke down, light bulbs flickered, shoes wore out quickly, and the shelves began to thin. Not always, and not everywhere, but enough that it became a quiet part of daily life. Long lines, unavailable goods, a whispered awareness that something, somehow, wasn't working quite right. But it was not only the economy that stagnated. Politics did too. Under Brezhnev, the Communist Party became increasingly gerontocratic, ruled by the elderly. Senior officials, many of whom had risen during Stalin's time, held onto their posts for decades. The Politburo meetings became slower, more ceremonial. Decisions were delayed. Risk was avoided. Loyalty was prized above talent. Appointments were made through nomenklatura, a closed list of trusted individuals approved for leadership roles. Mobility slowed, ambition dulled. Promotions were as much about relationships as results. The system hardened into a sort of quiet aristocracy, read not by color, but by tradition and privilege. Meanwhile, Soviet citizens adjusted. They went to work, they raised families. They played dominoes in courtyards. They vacationed at the Black Sea. They grew vegetables at their dachas. They sent their children to school, watched the evening news, celebrated New Year's and Victory Day, and increasingly, they compartmentalized. There was the official world, the slogans, the parades, the newspaper headlines filled with agricultural miracles and industrial triumphs. And then there was reality, quieter, more nuanced, full of compromises. Everyone knew the slogans were exaggerated. Everyone understood the numbers were polished. But few spoke out. Life, after all, was manageable. There were no mass purges, no famine. The KGB still watched, but it no longer dominated every conversation. As long as one did not protest, one could find a certain rhythm, a kind of quiet existence built on routine. In many ways, Soviet society matured in this period. Education levels rose. Literacy was near universal. Scientists made important discoveries. Ballet, theater, and classical music flourished. Soviet athletes won Olympic medals. Cities expanded. Subways extended into new districts. Housing, while cramped, was steadily built. Entire generations grew up under Brezhnev's leadership, children who knew no other world. But questions remained. Why were jeans and bananas still so hard to find? Why were apartments so hard to get without connections? Why did goods cost less than services? Why did a university professor earn the same as a bus driver? Why were the best medicines available only to the elite? Why did so many stores feel empty? For many, the answer was not rebellion. It was cynicism. People joked quietly. They told anecdote, short satirical stories that poked fun at bureaucracy, shortages, and the absurdities of life under communism. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. The future is certain. It's the past that keeps changing. What's the definition of a Soviet string quartet, a Soviet orchestra back from tour? Laughter became a kind of balm. It softened frustration. It built camaraderie. It signaled quiet understanding. Corruption, meanwhile, festered beneath the surface. Not the flamboyant corruption of gangsters or oligarchs, but a subtler, systemic kind, built into the machinery itself. Blatt, the informal network of favors, became essential. If you wanted a better apartment, a car, a rare medicine, or a decent winter coat, you needed connections. Not wealth, but access. A friend in a ministry, a cousin in a warehouse, a neighbor who knew someone who knew someone. Even leaders used the system. Brezhnev himself was said to enjoy foreign cars and fine suits. His health declined in the 1970s. His speech slowed. His movements grew stiff. Yet he remained in office, shielded by aides, surrounded by ritual. On state television, his appearances were broadcast with somber reverence, medals gleaming on his chest, voice thick with age, hands trembling slightly on the podium. He became less a leader and more a symbol of permanence, of tradition, of the idea that nothing would change too quickly. In foreign affairs, Brezhnev maintained the balance of the Cold War. He negotiated arms limitation treaties with the United States, salt-found the Helsinki Accords, while also suppressing dissent in Eastern Europe. In 1968, when Czechoslovakia attempted liberal reforms under Alexander Dubček, the Soviet Union invaded. Tanks rolling through Prague, hope crushed beneath steel treads. Brezhnev justified the action with a new doctrine. Any threat to socialism in one state was a threat to all. Yet even this was carried out with grim predictability. There was no hunger for conquest, just for control, for order. And still, inside the Soviet Union, quiet change flickered. Writers like Solzhenitsyn, despite exile, reached global audiences. Underground journals, known as samizdat, passed hand to hand. Western broadcasts were jammed, but not silenced. Soviet citizens, especially the young, began to listen to rock music, read forbidden books, and look beyond their borders. The gap between public conformity and private thought widened. And the economy, still grinding forward, showed deeper fatigue. Oil exports had masked inefficiencies, but agriculture lagged. Productivity declined. Factories used outdated equipment. The rigid structure of the 5-year plans no longer matched the complexity of modern production. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union appeared frozen, not collapsing, but stuck. Brezhnev died in November 1982 at the age of 75. His funeral was broadcast with solemnity. The nation mourned, not with shock, but with ceremony. Few wept. Many watched in silence, knowing, perhaps, that an era had ended not with catastrophe, but with a quiet exhale. He had ruled for nearly 2 decades. Under his watch, the Soviet Union had remained powerful, but had ceased to evolve. It had grown old, like him, dignified, weary, still wrapped in banners and medals, but losing touch with the world that was changing all around it. And ahead lay questions no one yet dared to ask aloud. What happens when a system stops moving? What follows after stagnation? And what price will be paid for years of standing still? The Soviet-Afghan War. It began in winter. In the final days of December 1979, under cover of night, thousands of Soviet troops crossed the Amu Darya River and entered the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. Their mission, as the Kremlin described it, was to assist an allied government under pressure, to protect socialism from encroaching imperialism, to stabilize the region, to restore order. But what followed was not stability. It was a long, grinding, and bitter war, a war the Soviet people were never fully prepared for, a war that unfolded far from home, beneath a blazing sun and among mountain passes few had ever heard of, a war that would, in time, sap the strength, faith, and morale of an already strained empire. To understand the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we must first go back to the political storm building within the country itself. In 1978, a revolution known as the Thaw Revolution overthrew the Afghan president and brought to power a Marxist-Leninist party, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. Backed in part by Soviet ideology and advisors, the new government sought to rapidly modernize the country. Land reform, education programs, secularization, and expanded rights for women were all introduced. But Afghanistan was not a nation easily reshaped. Its population was largely rural, deeply traditional, and ethnically complex. These reforms, introduced abruptly and enforced with harshness, were seen by many Afghans as an attack on their religion, customs, and tribal autonomy. Resistance brewed quickly. Entire regions revolted. Armed groups began to organize, calling themselves mujahideen, or those who struggle. Faced with growing chaos and infighting within the Afghan Communist Party itself, the Soviet leadership, under Brezhnev and later his cautious successors, made a fateful decision to intervene directly. On December 24th, 1979, Soviet tanks rolled in. More than 100,000 troops would eventually be stationed in Afghanistan, along with helicopters, armored vehicles, and elite special forces. The Soviet Union had fought many wars, against Nazis, against white armies, against internal threats. But this war would prove different. Afghanistan was not a country of clear front lines. It was a country of mountains and valleys, of ambushes and retreats, of sun-scorched villages and hidden caves. The Mujahideen were not a centralized army. They were a decentralized web of fighters, drawn from dozens of ethnic and tribal groups, Pashtun, Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, each with their own loyalties, grievances, and goals. They moved lightly, striking quickly and disappearing into the terrain. They used old rifles, captured weapons, and in time, Americans supplied Stinger missiles capable of downing Soviet helicopters. They were fueled not just by tactics, but by faith and memory. For many Afghans, the Soviet soldier was not a liberator, but a foreign occupier, a new empire trespassing on sacred ground. For the soldiers of the Red Army, Afghanistan was a world apart. Most were young conscripts, 18 or 19 years old. They had grown up in Leningrad or Baku, in Minsk or Novosibirsk. Some had never seen a desert before. Many had no idea why they were being sent. Their orders were vague. The climate was brutal. Supplies were unreliable. Morale was brittle. They faced an invisible enemy, constant fear, and a growing sense that victory was not only elusive, it was undefined. In the dusty garrisons of Kandahar, Herat, and Kabul, Soviet troops spent days on patrol, searching for guerrilla fighters, guarding roads, protecting convoys. They swept villages, set up checkpoints, engaged in firefights in narrow valleys where every rock might conceal a rifle. And when they returned to their bases, they wrote letters home. Those letters, sometimes censored, sometimes smuggled out, told a very different story from the official newsreels. They spoke of comrades killed by roadside bombs, of landmines hidden in toys, of locals who smiled by day and attacked by night, of children begging for water, of friends lost to ambushes, of a war without progress. Back in the Soviet Union, the conflict was rarely discussed openly. It was framed as a limited mission, a brotherly act of assistance. But funerals began to mount, quiet ceremonies for sons who had fallen in faraway valleys. The coffins arrived in zinc-lined boxes, often without full explanation, and over time, the silence cracked. Mothers asked questions. Veterans returned, broken not only in body, but in spirit. Some came back with missing limbs, others with psychological wounds that never healed. A growing network of Afghan war veterans, or Afghansi, began to share stories, first in whispers, later in books and poems. The war lasted nearly 10 years. Through the 1980s, it dragged on, across 5 general secretaries, across shifting battlefields, across endless seasons of dust, snow, and blood. The Soviets installed a new Afghan leader, Babrak Karmal, and later Mohammad Najibullah, but neither could fully control the countryside. Meanwhile, the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China funneled money, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen, seeing the conflict as a Cold War proxy, a way to drain the Soviet Union's resources and morale. But even beyond geopolitics, the human cost was staggering. By the time Soviet forces withdrew in February 1989, more than 15,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed. Tens of thousands were wounded. An entire generation of young men bore scars, visible and invisible. And in Afghanistan, the toll was far greater. Estimates suggest that over 1 million Afghans died, fighters and civilians alike. Villages were leveled, infrastructure destroyed, entire communities displaced. The landscape was littered with unexploded ordnance. Roads became minefields. The trauma would echo for decades. The Soviet withdrawal, led under Mikhail Gorbachev, was carefully choreographed but deeply symbolic. Tanks rolled north, flags were lowered. The last troops crossed the Friendship Bridge, greeted by quiet applause and haunting silence. The war, once justified in slogans, now ended with no victory parade, no declarations of success, only fatigue. In hindsight, the Afghan War became known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a costly, demoralizing, and unwinnable war that exposed the weaknesses of an aging empire. It shattered the illusion of invincibility. It drained the treasury. It accelerated the loss of faith, not just in the military, but in the system itself. Inside the Soviet Union, it deepened disillusionment. People who once believed in the promises of socialism began to ask harder questions. Why had so many died for so little? What had been achieved? Where was the accountability? Where was the truth? For writers, filmmakers, and artists, the war became a powerful symbol of futility, of suffering, of the gap between official language and lived experience. Films like The Ninth Company, books like Zinky Boys by Svetlana Alexievich, and songs sung by veterans brought the war's memory into the public eye, not with triumph, but with grief. And in the years that followed, that grief began to compound. Because Afghanistan, in many ways, was not just a conflict, it was a mirror held up to the Soviet state, revealing a system increasingly out of touch, weighed down by secrecy, denial, and inertia. It showed a leadership unwilling to change, a military forced into a war it couldn't define, a society no longer able to sustain belief in the old narratives. When the final Soviet soldier stepped off Afghan soil, it marked more than an end. It marked a turning, the beginning of the unraveling, the moment when even the most loyal citizens began to see that the empire they had inherited might not endure forever. Chernobyl, the disaster that shook the state. It began with a test, a routine safety experiment on a quiet April night. A simulated power outage at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near the small town of Pripyat in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. What followed was not a test, it was catastrophe. The Chernobyl disaster did not begin with fire or sirens or alarms. It began with silence, with a flicker in the control room, a series of ignored warnings, and a moment of cascading failure. The kind that turns seconds into history. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, the core of Reactor 4 exploded. Not with a single boom, but with a series of violent bursts that tore the massive steel and concrete structure apart. The roof was thrown into the air. Flames danced into the night sky. A blue-white beam, shaped like a pillar of light, rose into the darkness. The eerie glow of ionized air, a silent sign that something invisible and deadly had been released. It was radiation, and it was everywhere. The blast ejected radioactive material into the atmosphere. Iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90. Elements that clung to dust particles, floated on winds, and rained down on forests, fields, and cities. The explosion was not just an industrial accident. It was the worst nuclear disaster in human history. But in the first hours, no one outside knew. The nearby town of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people, slept unaware. A model Soviet town, Pripyat had been built in the 1970s to house plant workers and their families. It had tree-lined avenues, schools, a cinema, a supermarket, playgrounds, and a gleaming mud amusement park, with bumper cars and a yellow Ferris wheel scheduled to open for the May Day celebrations. That morning, children went to school. Residents went about their routines. Some gathered on balconies to watch the distant plume of smoke, unaware that every breath drew in microscopic particles that could not be felt, tasted, or seen. In the control room, confusion reigned. In Moscow, silence prevailed. The Soviet system was built on secrecy. Information flowed upward, cautiously, filtered, adjusted to suit political needs. The full scope of the disaster was not immediately reported, not to the local authorities, not to the general population, and not to the world. The first official announcement came 36 hours later, as buses arrived to evacuate Pripyat. A calm voice on a loudspeaker urged residents to pack a small bag, clothing, documents, food, and assured them they would return in a few days. They never would. The evacuation was methodical, but heart-wrenching. Parents carried sleeping babies. Children clutched toys. Dogs barked, confused, as their owners stepped onto waiting buses. The people of Pripyat left behind photo albums, teacups, bicycles, wedding dresses, unopened letters, the quiet tokens of lives interrupted. Meanwhile, the fire raged on. It took 10 days to fully extinguish. Firefighters, many of them unaware of the radiation hazard, fought with courage. They stood close to the glowing remains of the reactor, climbing onto the roof, hosing water into the inferno. Some were exposed to lethal doses within seconds. Others succumbed over hours, days, weeks. They were the first victims of what would become a radiological nightmare. The Soviet leadership hesitated. They debated, delayed, and controlled messaging. Even as radioactive clouds drifted over Belarus, Poland, Sweden, and eventually Western Europe, there was no formal admission of a disaster. It was only when Swedish scientists detected a dramatic spike in radiation at their own power plant and traced the source back east that the world began to realize something was terribly wrong. On April 28th, 2 days after the explosion, Soviet television finally broadcast a brief, vague statement. An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Measures are being undertaken to eliminate the consequences. It was a single paragraph. No images, no details, no apology. Inside the affected zone, however, the scale of devastation was impossible to hide. The zone of alienation, as it came to be known, was a ring of exclusion, a 30-kilometer radius around the plant. Towns, farms, and villages were evacuated. Over 300,000 people would eventually be relocated. Forests turned red and died. Cattle were slaughtered. Fields lay fallow. Roads were closed. Soldiers erected fences and checkpoints. Trains were rerouted. Entire landscapes became still. Chernobyl was no longer a place. It was a wound. But the fight to contain the disaster was only just beginning. Thousands of liquidators, firefighters, miners, soldiers, scientists, engineers, and volunteers were mobilized to control the damage. They worked in shifts, often for mere minutes at a time, exposed to levels of radiation far beyond safe limits. Some shoveled radioactive debris from rooftops. Others cut down forests, buried contaminated soil, or operated bulldozers. Helicopter pilots flew over the open core, dropping sand, boron, and lead to stifle the reaction. Miners were sent underground to dig a tunnel beneath the reactor, to install a cooling slab. They worked shirtless in suffocating heat, knowing they would pay a price. Most were told very little. They obeyed. They served. Many later fell ill. The official death toll, as presented by Soviet authorities, remained low, just a few dozen in the immediate aftermath. But the true cost is still debated. Estimates of long-term cancer deaths, birth defects, and chronic illnesses range in the tens or even hundreds of thousands. More than just lives were lost. Trust was shattered. For decades, Soviet citizens had accepted the system's flaws, the cues, the censorship, the bland slogans, because it offered order, security, and a sense of purpose. But now, with Chernobyl, something changed. People saw truth suppressed, health endangered, lives sacrificed for the appearance of control. Mothers watched their children fall ill. Villagers were told to return to clean up their own homes. Soldiers were sent in without proper protection. And all the while, the state insisted everything was under control. This disconnect between reality and rhetoric became impossible to ignore. Writers, scientists, and journalists began to speak out. Photos were leaked, diaries circulated. A new generation of Soviets, no longer willing to pretend, began to demand Glasnost, or openness. They wanted answers, accountability, a reckoning. For Mikhail Gorbachev, the relatively new General Secretary, Chernobyl was a turning point. He had inherited a system already creaking under its own weight, economically, politically, culturally. But after Chernobyl, he began to understand that transparency was not optional. Without it, the system would rot from within. In the years that followed, he would push for reform. He would call for perestroika, restructuring. But the shadows of Chernobyl lingered. And so, the plant that once symbolized Soviet progress became its undoing. The reactor was eventually entombed in a massive steel and concrete sarcophagus, hastily constructed to contain further radiation. Later, a larger structure, the new safe confinement, was built, a silver arch stretching like a monument to hubris and warning. Pripyat remains empty. Its apartments are overgrown, its classrooms frozen in time. Dolls lie in dusty cribs, rusting bicycles lean against peeling walls. The Ferris wheel, which never carried a single rider, towers above cracked concrete, motionless, silent, and golden in the light. Chernobyl is not merely a disaster site. It is a symbol of what happens when secrecy overtakes science, when ideology overrules integrity, when a system loses the ability to tell the truth, even to itself. And in its silence, the Soviet Union began to unravel. Not with a bomb, not with a speech, but with an explosion in the dark, and the lies that followed it. Gorbachev, Glasnost, and Perestroika. In the spring of 1985, a new wind began to blow through the thick corridors of the Kremlin. The Soviet Union, weary from years of stagnation, still cloaked in secrecy and weighed down by bureaucracy, was about to meet a man unlike any leader before him. His name was Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. He was only 54 years old, youthful by Politburo standards, articulate, confident, and, most surprisingly, open to change. The older generation of leadership had passed almost silently. Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. All had died within a short span of years. The party, long dominated by grey faces and cautious whispers, needed new blood. Gorbachev was not just younger. He was a reformer, thoughtful, pragmatic, shaped not by war but by post-war ideals. And he carried with him two words that would reshape history: Perestroika and Glasnost. At first, these were just concepts. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, was a call to modernize the Soviet economy, to bring efficiency, innovation, and flexibility to a system grown sluggish. Glasnost, or openness, was something even more radical, a cultural and political awakening, a promise to lift the veil of secrecy, to allow free expression, honest criticism, and public dialogue. For a system built on silence, these were revolutionary ideas. Gorbachev believed the USSR could be saved. He did not seek to destroy communism, nor to abandon socialism. His goal was to make the system work better, to reform, not erase. But as with many ideals, the consequences would be far more complex than he imagined. He began with small gestures. He met with Western leaders. He spoke of peace, disarmament, shared humanity. He smiled in interviews. He encouraged journalists to investigate. He gave speeches filled not with slogans, but sincerity. And soon, change began to ripple. In the economy, Gorbachev launched efforts to decentralize production, to introduce limited private enterprise, to encourage worker responsibility and reduce waste. New laws allowed cooperatives, small, private businesses in food, services, and manufacturing. Citizens could now open cafes, workshops, and studios, modest ventures, but remarkable in a state long ruled by central command. But the economy did not respond smoothly. Factories, long used to rigid quotas and state subsidies, struggled to adapt. Supplies were mismatched. Inflation rose. Shortages deepened. Store shelves, already sparse, became more barren. Workers lost patience. Managers feared reform. The black market swelled. People who had known hardship now began to feel uncertainty, which in some ways felt worse. Still, Gorbachev pressed forward. He understood that economic change required cultural change. And so Glasnost expanded. Newspapers began publishing stories of corruption. Literary journals printed once banned authors. Citizens wrote letters to editors, criticizing officials, exposing abuse. State television aired documentaries on pollution, prison conditions, and social inequality. The public, long silent, now spoke. And they spoke freely. This freedom brought pain and clarity in equal measure. Long suppressed histories emerged. The truth of Stalin's purges was revisited. Survivors of labor camps came forward. Books once circulated only in secret. Samizdat now appeared in bookstores. School curriculums were rewritten. Statues were questioned. Heroes re-evaluated. What had once been whispered over kitchen tables was now said on national television. People were not only learning the truth, they were remembering. Chernobyl, only a few years behind them, now loomed larger in public consciousness. Why had the government waited to tell the people? Why had mothers and children been exposed? Why had lies persisted so long? Glasnost was not just about freedom of speech. It was about memory. It was a national reckoning with the past. But with memory came pain. Old wounds opened. Nationalities that had been forcibly unified under Soviet identity began to assert their voices. Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Georgians, Armenians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs. All began to demand recognition, autonomy, even independence. And Gorbachev, unlike his predecessors, did not immediately crush these movements. In 1989, he made a fateful decision to not use military force to maintain Soviet control over Eastern Europe. When people in Poland elected non-communist leaders, he let them. When Hungary opened its border to the west, he did not stop them. And when citizens of East Germany approached the Berlin Wall, he watched but did not interfere. This was unprecedented. For decades, the Soviet Union had ruled the Eastern Bloc through tanks, threats, and fear. Now, it watched as those dominoes began to fall, not with revolution, but with resolve. In the streets of Prague, Budapest, Warsaw, and East Berlin, ordinary people began to march, not in silence, but in song. Gorbachev, to the shock of his hardline colleagues, refused to order suppression. He believed reform should come from within, not be imposed from above. But back home, in the Soviet republics, the fabric of unity began to fray. Ethnic tensions erupted in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. In Tbilisi, Georgian demonstrators were beaten back with force. In the Baltic states, human chains formed, miles-long lines of citizens holding hands in peaceful protest. And all the while, the economy worsened. By the late 1980s, Soviet citizens were queuing for hours for basic necessities. Soap, meat, sugar, even bread became scarce. The ruble lost value. Salaries shrank. Strikes spread. Trains ran late. Electricity failed. Frustration turned into anger. Gorbachev faced pressure from all sides. The old guard believed he had gone too far, that Glasnost had unleashed chaos, that Perestroika had broken the system. The young reformers, meanwhile, believed he hadn't gone far enough, that only full democracy and a market economy could save the Union. And then, into the spotlight, stepped a new charismatic figure, Boris Yeltsin. Once a Communist Party leader in Moscow, Yeltsin had broken with Gorbachev over the pace of reform. He became a populist voice, railing against privilege, corruption, and the slow bureaucracy of the Kremlin. His fiery speeches, made in public squares and broadcast on TV, attracted growing support. The rivalry between Gorbachev and Yeltsin would become a defining feature of the final Soviet years. Gorbachev still believed the Union could be saved, as a reformed, decentralized federation. But events were moving faster than him now. Nationalist movements spread. Republics declared sovereignty. Flags changed. Border posts reappeared. Old languages resurfaced. 1,000 years of identity, long buried, came rushing to the surface. And through it all, Gorbachev remained committed to peaceful transition. His efforts earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, recognizing his role in reducing Cold War tensions, his efforts at arms reduction with the United States, and his decision to let Eastern Europe go. But inside the Soviet Union, peace felt like instability. In August 1991, hardliners launched a coup, a desperate attempt to reverse reform. They detained Gorbachev at his summer home in Crimea. Tanks rolled into Moscow. State TV broadcast solemn music. But the people rose. Tens of thousands flooded the streets of Moscow. Civilians blocked tanks. Protesters gathered at the Russian Parliament building. And on top of a tank, arms raised, stood Boris Yeltsin, defiant, fearless, embodying a new Russia. The coup failed. The hardliners were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. But the world had changed. The balance of power had shifted, not just politically, but emotionally. The people no longer looked to the Kremlin for guidance. They looked elsewhere, to their republics, their regions, and increasingly to Boris Yeltsin. In the final months of 1991, one by one, The republics declared independence. By December, Gorbachev stood alone, president of a country that no longer existed. On December 25th, he resigned, his voice calm, his eyes weary. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The Soviet Union was no more. Republics in revolt, the fall of the Eastern Bloc. By the end of the 1980s, a quiet storm had begun to move across the lands once held tightly in the embrace of the Soviet Union. It was not a storm of tanks or bombs. It was slower, softer, yet no less powerful. It moved through whispers, through gatherings in public squares, through printing presses, through candles held aloft in silent vigils. One by one, the republics and satellite states of the Eastern Bloc began to stir, and soon they began to rise. For decades, Moscow had ruled not only the vast Soviet Union itself, from the forests of Belarus to the deserts of Central Asia, but also a string of Eastern European nations known as the Warsaw Pact: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria. Each operated under a communist government loyal to the Kremlin, enforced by the ever-present threat of Soviet tanks. But by the late 1980s, the grip began to loosen. And with that loosening came revolt, not sudden, but steady. It began in Poland. Of all the Soviet satellites, Poland had long been the most restless. In the shipyards of Gdansk, a quiet movement had grown over the years, led not by generals or bureaucrats, but by workers. They called themselves Solidarity. Their leader was a charismatic electrician named Lech Wałęsa. In 1980, Solidarity had been declared illegal. Strikes had been crushed. Martial law had been imposed. But the idea endured, and underground, it grew stronger. By 1989, Gorbachev's refusal to use force gave the movement space to breathe again. That year, the Polish government held partially free elections, a staggering concession. And to nearly everyone's surprise, Solidarity won. A non-communist government took office. The tide had turned. Poland had shown it was possible to move away from Soviet-style socialism peacefully. From there, the movement flowed like water, finding every crack in old stone. In Hungary, reformers within the Communist Party quietly began dismantling one-party rule. Borders were opened. In the summer of 1989, thousands of East Germans, vacationing in Hungary, crossed into Austria, escaping westward, bypassing the Berlin Wall. This symbolic breach revealed just how fragile that wall had become. And then came East Germany. The German Democratic Republic had long been one of the most loyal and heavily policed members of the Eastern Bloc. Its citizens lived under a web of surveillance, their lives watched by the Stasi, the state security service. Dissent was dangerous. But the changes in neighboring countries emboldened East Germans. In the fall of 1989, protests began in Leipzig. Peaceful gatherings turned into marches. Candles lit the night. The chant echoed through the crowd. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. By November, tens of thousands were marching in the streets of East Berlin. Then, without warning, a mistake changed everything. A government spokesperson, misunderstanding a press briefing, announced that East Berliners were now free to cross into West Berlin. That night, November 9, 1989, thousands approached the checkpoints. Confused border guards, unsure of orders, let them pass. Crowds surged. People climbed atop the wall. Some chipped at it with hammers. Others embraced across the divide. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had been the starkest symbol of the Cold War, a concrete division between East and West, between communism and democracy, between isolation and freedom. Now it fell, not with violence, but with joy. Across Europe, the echo was thunderous. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution swept through Prague. Students protested. Artists spoke out. Václav Havel, once imprisoned for his words, stood before a cheering crowd as president. The change was swift, peaceful, and poetic. Velvet in name, velvet in nature. In Bulgaria, longtime leader Todor Zhivkov was ousted by his own party. In Romania, the revolt turned violent. The dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, once untouchable, was arrested and executed after a rapid trial, the old order collapsing in blood and disbelief. In just 1 year, 1989, the Eastern Bloc disintegrated. But this was only part of the story. Inside the Soviet Union itself, the republics watched closely. For years, they had been held together by ideology, by inertia, by the sheer force of Soviet central power. Now, that power looked less like a monolith and more like a fading shadow. The first to move were the Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia had been annexed by the Soviet Union during World War II, an act many citizens never accepted. Their national languages, cultures, and flags had endured underground. And now, under Glasnost, they emerged into the light. In 1989, nearly 2 million people formed the Baltic Way, a human chain stretching over 600 kilometers, linking Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn. Hand in hand, they stood in silence, their bodies forming a living thread of unity and resistance. It was not just a protest, it was a symbol of endurance, of memory, of a desire to reclaim what had been lost. The following year, Lithuania declared independence. Latvia and Estonia soon followed. Moscow denounced the declarations, but stopped short of full-scale military response. In the Caucasus, demands grew louder. In Georgia, mass protests in Tbilisi were met with violence. Dozens were killed. But the movement did not stop. In Armenia, the long-frozen conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh reignited nationalist fervor. In Azerbaijan, calls for autonomy turned into mass rallies. In Ukraine, long considered the heart of the USSR, a wave of cultural revival surged. Poets, priests, and students marching for sovereignty, remembering the famines of the 1930s, the repressions, the buried truths. Each republic had its own pain, its own identity, its own dreams of something beyond Moscow's reach. Some wanted independence, others sought a looser federation, but all of them felt the ground shift beneath their feet. Back in the Kremlin, Gorbachev watched with a mixture of resolve and helplessness. He believed in reform, but not in collapse. He sought to create a new union treaty, one that would redefine the USSR as a voluntary federation of sovereign republics. Discussions began, agreements were drafted, but events were outrunning intentions. In March 1991, a nationwide referendum showed that many citizens still wanted a reimagined Soviet Union. Yet by August, that hope was derailed by the attempted coup against Gorbachev, an act that fatally weakened his leadership and accelerated the momentum of the republics. In the months that followed, one after another, the Soviet republics declared independence. Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, all stepped away from the Union, not with rage, but with determination. And so, what had once been a mighty empire, stitched together by revolution, ruled by ideology, and held fast by iron, now fell apart not with war, but with words, declarations, resolutions, and rising flags. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine met quietly in a forest dacha in Belovezha, signed an agreement declaring the USSR dissolved, and created the Commonwealth of Independent States. It was over. The republics had revolted, but not in fury. They had done so with memory, with history, with songs and symbols, with the quiet but unbreakable belief that their futures no longer lay beneath a red flag. For some, the end was liberation. For others, it was disorientation. Old certainties vanished. New paths lay uncertain. But in the silence that followed, the Soviet Union was no more. replaced not by a single successor, but by 15 nations, each with its own language, leadership, and future to forge. The August coup and the end of an empire. The summer of 1991 was heavy with unease. The air in Moscow hung thick, not just with the weight of humidity, but with something more difficult to name. The streets looked normal. The buses still ran. The Soviet flag still flew above the Kremlin. But behind closed doors, across dashes and state offices, through corridors lined with red carpet and portraits of Marx and Lenin, something was unraveling. Mikhail Gorbachev had, for years, walked a tightrope of impossible expectations. His reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika, had stirred hope, criticism, and instability in equal measure. He had opened the door to freedoms long withheld, but in doing so, he had also awakened forces he could no longer contain. The republics were drifting away, declaring independence one by one. The economy was in turmoil. Shortages plagued shops. Faith in the central government waned, and within his own ranks, Gorbachev's authority was quietly eroding. Among the Soviet elite, aging military officials, entrenched party functionaries, KGB leaders, fear began to take hold. Not fear of foreign invasion, nor of revolution in the classical sense, but of loss of control, loss of privilege, loss of the Soviet Union itself. They called themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency. Internally, they were known simply as the Gang of Eight. They included Gennady Yanayev, the vice president, whose hands would soon tremble on live television; Valentin Pavlov, the prime minister; Boris Pugo, the interior minister; Dmitry Yazov, the defense minister; Vladimir Khrushchev, head of the KGB; and several other senior officials who had spent their lives in the service of the Soviet state, men who had risen through loyalty, conformity, and quiet obedience. By August, Gorbachev was preparing to sign a new Union treaty, one that would transform the USSR into a looser federation of sovereign republics. It was meant to be a compromise, a final attempt to hold the Union together through consent rather than force. To the hardliners, it felt like betrayal. On August 18th, with the treaty days away from being signed, Gorbachev was at his holiday home in Foros, Crimea. There, surrounded by pine trees and the hush of the Black Sea, his communications were cut. His guards were replaced. Visitors arrived with a demand: declare a state of emergency or resign. He refused. They placed him under house arrest. The next morning, August 19th, 1991, Soviet citizens awoke to an unexpected broadcast. A solemn announcement declared that Gorbachev was ill and unable to perform his duties. A new state of emergency had been declared. Tanks were rolling into Moscow. The committee, the Gang of Eight, was now in charge. But something was different. This coup did not come with thunder or fire. There was no dramatic address from the Red Square balcony, no charismatic general leading troops through the capital, no widespread arrests or purges. It arrived with confusion, slow, clumsy, uncertain. In Moscow, armored vehicles rumbled past grocery stores and apartment blocks. Soldiers stood by metro entrances, not knowing exactly what orders they were following. The state television played classical music and ballet instead of news. The broadcasters were silent. And into that silence stepped Boris Yeltsin, the recently elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Yeltsin had a populist touch that Gorbachev lacked. He had criticized the party, championed reform, and built his base of support outside the traditional Soviet system. Now, with the coup underway and the Kremlin isolated, Yeltsin emerged as the defiant voice of resistance. He was driven to the Russian White House, the parliament building where his office was located, a tall, blocky structure overlooking the Moskva River. Thousands of citizens gathered outside, forming a human barricade. Some carried flags, others linked arms. Workers and students, artists and clerks, They came not with weapons, but with resolve. Then, in one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century, Boris Yeltsin climbed atop a tank stationed outside the building. He stood tall, holding a microphone, his white shirt open at the collar, his voice strong despite the tension. With TV cameras rolling, he condemned the coup as illegal, called for mass resistance, and urged the military to disobey unlawful orders. The image was electric. The message was clear. The coup, already unsure of itself, began to crumble. That evening, crowds grew. Citizens built makeshift barricades from buses, garbage bins, even benches. Some brought food to the soldiers, unsure if they were enemies or hostages in uniform. Russian flags flew alongside Soviet ones. Hymns were sung. The city held its breath. Inside the White House, nervous parliamentarians huddled in candlelight, unsure if troops would storm the building by dawn. But the dawn came, and the troops never did. By August 21st, it was clear the coup had failed. Units refused orders, commanders defected. The streets remained in the people's hands. Even the KGB, once feared beyond measure, hesitated. Gorbachev was freed and flown back to Moscow, but he returned to a country that no longer looked to him. Though technically restored as president of the USSR, Gorbachev's power had evaporated. He gave a televised speech, appearing tired, shaken, and distant. The applause was polite, but the crowd and the cameras were now focused on Yeltsin. In a final symbolic act, Yeltsin banned the Communist Party in Russia. He ordered the seizure of its archives. Statues of Lenin were pulled down. The red star on government buildings began to disappear. Republic after republic moved swiftly toward full independence. By December 1991, the end was formalized. In a snowy dacha in Belavezha, hidden among the pine forests of Belarus, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met quietly. They signed a document stating that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had ceased to exist. It was replaced by a voluntary organization, the Commonwealth of Independent States. A few weeks later, on December 25th, Gorbachev appeared on national television one final time. He announced his resignation as president of a country that no longer existed. Behind him, the Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle on a red field, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. It was the end of the Soviet Union. There was no grand ceremony, no battle to mark the fall, no anthem played, only silence. And then something new, the vast empire that had once stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, that had survived world wars, revolutions, famines, and purges, ended in the span of a few months, not by fire or invasion, but by disillusionment, indecision, and the quiet withdrawal of belief. And it was the August coup that marked the turning point. What had been intended as a return to order, instead, laid bare just how little was left to hold on to. The machinery of the state still turned, but it did so without conviction. The myth of permanence, that the Soviet Union would last forever, was finally broken. In the years that followed, the former Soviet republics would each carve their own paths, some toward democracy, others toward authoritarianism, some toward prosperity, others into hardship and unrest. Russia itself would grapple with a new identity, struggling to reconcile the promises of the past with the chaos of the present. But for those who lived through that August, who stood beneath tanks, climbed barricades, or sat by radios in distant villages, the memory endures, not of an empire ending in violence, but of a strange and silent surrender, a collapse as quiet as snowfall. And in that quiet, the world shifted. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. The end came, not with thunder, but with an echo, not with a single decisive act, but with many quiet ones. By December 1991, the Soviet Union, once the world's largest country, stretching across 11 time zones, encompassing nearly 300 million people, armed with thousands of nuclear warheads and a vast army, was no longer a functioning state. It had unraveled piece by piece, republic by republic, institution by institution. What remained was a shell, a name without substance. But names, like monuments, do not fall easily. They linger, even as the world beneath them changes. That December, in the cold hush of winter, history shifted once more. Not in war rooms or parliaments, but in modest offices, at kitchen tables, in unheated apartments where families listened to the radio, unsure what might come next. It was December 8th, 1991, when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in secrecy at a forest retreat in Belovezha, within the snow-blanketed woods of western Belarus. There, in a quiet dacha, surrounded by pine trees and frost-covered windows, they signed the Belovezha Accords, a document that, in 12 dry paragraphs, declared the USSR had ceased to exist. The Soviet Union, it stated, was no longer a legal or political entity. In its place would rise a new structure, the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose alliance of former republics, tied not by ideology, but by shared logistics, pipelines, borders, and history. The document was sent to Mikhail Gorbachev, who had not been invited to the meeting. When he read it, he knew what it meant. His presidency, his vision for a reformed union, his years of cautious progress and idealistic compromise, all of it was over. 2 weeks later, on December 21st, in Alma-Ata, now Almaty, Kazakhstan, 11 former Soviet republics confirmed the dissolution. Only Georgia and the 3 Baltic states, already asserting full independence, declined to join. The Alma-Ata Protocol made it official. The Soviet Union would not see the new year. Still, Gorbachev held office, in name only. He moved through a half-abandoned Kremlin, spoke to shrinking staff, looked out windows as flags changed. His authority was evaporating hour by hour, overtaken by the assertive new power of Boris Yeltsin, president of Russia, now, by default, the leader of the largest post-Soviet republic. Yeltsin moved quickly. He seized control of the Kremlin, the Soviet military, the KGB, the central bank, and the nuclear codes. The red star on the Kremlin towers, long a symbol of Soviet permanence, still gleamed, but its meaning was changing. And then, on December 25th, 1991, at 7 o'clock p.m., Gorbachev addressed the nation for the last time. His face, framed by wood-paneled walls and soft studio lighting, appeared calm. He wore a dark suit. His tone was measured, firm, but weary. There was no dramatic farewell, no tears, no rage. He spoke of accomplishments, Glasnost, Perestroika, the end of the Cold War. He spoke of dreams, a democratic socialism never fully realized. He acknowledged mistakes. He wished his country peace. And then, at 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The red banner, bearing the hammer and sickle, the golden star, fluttered down for the last time. In its place rose the tricolor of Russia, white, blue, and red. Outside, in the snowy darkness of Red Square, people watched in silence. Some wept, some stood motionless, others simply turned and walked away. And just like that, the USSR was gone. But what does it mean for a country to vanish? For decades, the Soviet Union had shaped its citizens' entire lives. From the cereal they ate to the jobs they worked, the books they read, the borders they crossed. It had created cosmonauts and coal miners, poets and prison camps, subway systems and secret police. Its symbols were woven into every street corner and schoolbook. It had been, for better or worse, the center of the world for millions. Its dissolution left behind not a single legacy, but many. In Russia, the mood was mixed. Some felt liberation, others grief. Suddenly, Their nation was not a superpower, but a struggling new republic. The ruble plummeted, salaries vanished, pensions were delayed, shops emptied, entire industries collapsed. The planned economy, long inefficient, gave way to a chaotic and often corrupt capitalism. The result was a kind of whiplash, from rigid control to unchecked freedom. Some thrived, many did not. Oligarchs rose, state assets were sold for pennies, factories closed, crime increased. Entire generations, once promised stability and purpose, now faced unemployment, confusion, and the erosion of a world they had spent their lives understanding. In the former republics, experiences varied. Ukraine, newly independent, grappled with its Soviet past and its national future. It adopted a new currency, struggled with inflation, and began to navigate its long road towards self-definition. Kazakhstan, rich in natural resources, sought economic alliances while managing its ethnic diversity. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, moved swiftly toward the west, eager to join NATO and the European Union. But not all transitions were smooth. Civil wars erupted in parts of the Caucasus. Tajikistan descended into internal conflict. Moldova faced separatist tensions in Transnistria. Georgia struggled with breakaway regions. Armenia and Azerbaijan returned to open war over Nagorno-Karabakh. The power vacuum left by Moscow gave rise to fragile governments, new constitutions, and, in some cases, new authoritarianisms. The Commonwealth of Independent States, designed as a bridge between past and future, became largely symbolic, a loose forum with little real influence. Meanwhile, the international community adjusted quickly. The United States, the European powers, China, and others all recognized Russia as the successor state to the USSR. Russia assumed the Soviet seat at the United Nations, including its permanent position on the Security Council. It inherited the nuclear arsenal, though agreements were made to return warheads from Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan back to Russian control. There was no peace treaty, no occupation, no formal burial, only the turning of a page. In the years that followed, memory became a battlefield. Some remembered the Soviet Union with bitterness, the censorship, the famines, the repression, the forced conformity. Others remembered it with nostalgia, the guaranteed housing, the sense of pride, the space program, the idea of belonging to something immense. In some towns, statues of Lenin were torn down. In others, they were left standing. Street names were changed, then changed again. School curriculums rewrote the past, but the past was stubborn. For many, the end of the USSR was not just a geopolitical shift, it was a personal unraveling. What did it mean to be Soviet? What came next when the country you belonged to ceased to exist? Elderly pensioners in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, lined up outside empty pharmacies. Former party members looked for work in the new economy. Young students in Tashkent or Yerevan or Minsk began learning English and German instead of Russian. Soldiers returned to bases that no longer flew their flag, and in a way, all of them were waking from a dream, one that had lasted 74 years. Today, the legacy of the Soviet Union still lingers, in its successor states, in the minds of its former citizens, in its art and architecture, in the tension between past and present. The nuclear weapons remain, so does the bureaucracy in many forms. The language of comrade has faded, but the habits of hierarchy endure. In Russia, power eventually centralized again. The Soviet anthem, with new lyrics, was restored. The echoes of empire are never far. But the Soviet Union, as it once existed, as a unified communist superstate stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, is gone. It ended in the quiet dark of a Moscow winter, as a red flag lowered for the last time. No war had toppled it, No foreign army had marched in. It collapsed beneath the weight of its contradictions, the hopes of its citizens, the pressures of reform, and the power of truth. And like all empires, it passed into history, remembered, debated, mourned, and reimagined. But it left behind a lesson that no system, however vast, can last forever. That change, once awakened, cannot be undone. And that even the greatest powers can fade, not in a blaze, but in a whisper. I hope you enjoyed tonight's sleep story, tracing the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, from the twilight of the Tsars and the fires of revolution, through the vast machinery of Soviet power, the tragedies of war, the quiet courage of dissent, and the final lowering of the red flag. A journey through one of the most complex and consequential chapters in human history. If you're still awake, that's more than okay. Just allow your mind to soften and your thoughts to wander like wind across the empty steppes. Slow, steady, unburdened. There's nothing to figure out now, nothing to hold on to, only rest. And if you'd like to explore more, we have many other sleep stories waiting for you, Boo. Journeys through ancient civilizations, forgotten mysteries, and distant lands, all told gently to guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Wherever you are in the world, from snowy cities to quiet countryside, I wish you peace, stillness, and a deep, restful night. Sleep well.